Testing,
things that when you look at these
testing,
things,
testing.
so much more densely. so this is the Commission's rulemaking on rulemaking 76 on utility cybersecurity practices. So why don't we sort of have folks introduce themselves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian Quinn with the Venable Firm on behalf of a joint utility group that filed comments earlier. And we've asked a couple of witnesses to join us.
Sure.
And they can introduce themselves, or I'm happy to introduce them. Sure. Scott, why don't you go ahead?
Either way.
Hey, good afternoon, Scott Aronson. I am with the Edison Electric Institute. We're a trade association that represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies, including both First Energy and Exelon as the holding companies here in Maryland.
Back to me, Mr. Chairman, real quick. Rick Mraz is on the, he's video.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for accommodating that, and he's here on our behalf as well. I don't know if he can hear us, but Rick's, I think some of you may know him. He's a former chair of the New Jersey BPU, and he's going to offer some comments proactively.
Okay.
And then we also have Scott Hipkins and Jason McCormick in the audience from First Energy, who are just here to answer any technical questions you guys might have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Hey, Mr. Chairman. My name is Lance Cleghorn. I'm the Director for State Cybersecurity representing DeWitt in the state of Maryland.
Okay.
I'm Cyril Draffin, the Vice Chairman of the Maryland Cybersecurity Council Infrastructure Committee. I'm also Senior Fellow for Advanced Nuclear at the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council and was the MIT Energy Initiative Cybersecurity Lead for the Utility of the Future study.
Good afternoon. I'm John Borkowski with the Public Service Commission, and I'm the leader of the Cybersecurity Reporting Work Group.
Good afternoon. Ryan Hsu on behalf of Office of People's Counsel.
Yes, sir.
And Mike Dean on behalf of staff.
Alrighty, so I think what we're going to do is actually allow some of the parties to make some introductory comments on, where the draft regulations are and any other issues they want to raise. And we're going to start with Mr. Draffin.
Chair Hoover, Commissioners Hushman and Richard and Barvey, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Several of us from the Maryland Cybersecurity Council Infrastructure Committee were involved in the 2023 discussions that resulted in the cybersecurity bill that we're discussing today. A key resource for us was the study prepared by an NSA fellow on cybersecurity, and we submitted that for the record. We are currently involved in the Cybersecurity Working Group, and we appreciate the leadership of John Borkowski in that. Malware is found in many U.S. utilities. Last month, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, NSA, and FBI assessed that, quote, with high confidence, unquote, the actors sponsored by the People's Republic of China have compromised the IT environments of multiple critical infrastructure organizations, primarily in the communications, energy, transportation, water, and wastewater sectors. In Maryland, we want to make sure that the cybersecurity standards keep up with the threats that we're facing. So I will be talking about three topics. These are the kind of the unresolved issues for the rulemaking that came out of the working group. First, that the scope of the proposed cybersecurity regulations, and we believe that Maryland can go beyond the federal FERC regulations. Second, cybersecurity incident reporting, and we think a middle ground can be reached by relying on the NERC initiative. And finally, on zero-based trust architecture and implementation, we think you can rely upon the NIST implementation direction. So let's cover them one by one. The first, on the scope of proposed cybersecurity regulations, the question was raised whether the NERC cyber standards preempt any attempt by this PSC to impose cybersecurity requirements. The Federal Power Act, as interpreted by FERC, makes clear that the cyber regulation of bulk systems is not preempted by federal regulation. Section 215 states that nothing in this section shall be construed to preempt any authority of any state to take action to ensure the safety, adequacy, and reliability of electric service within that state, as long as that action is not inconsistent with any reliability standards and refers to cybersecurity protection. Finally, FERC issued an order 672 that said, in general, a state action that simply sets an additional, not a substitute, reliability requirement or the proposed more stringent reliability requirement is not otherwise inconsistent with the rule, should not be precluded. Consequently, we see no federal limitation on the Public Service Commission's authority to regulate cybersecurity on the bulk power systems, as long as those regulations are not inconsistent with the FERC standards, and that the PSC can address cybersecurity standards for distribution companies which are not covered by FERC. Second, regarding incident reporting, there's a concern by some that the COMAR definition will result in over-reporting that will be burdensome to industry stakeholders and could be of little incremental value. We see the definition needs to be modified, and the joint utilities and the office of Senator Hester raised good points. But it's important for the state to know about incidents have a serious potential to impact confidentiality, integrity, and availability of company systems. And we also point out that the industry stakeholders already operate on a reporting requirement that goes beyond the current COMAR definition. In 2018, FERC directed NERC to expand mandatory reporting of cybersecurity incidents to include compromises of or attempts to compromise. And a recent FERC review has resulted in a standards authorization request to NERC Standards Committee to revise the SIP standard to provide clarity on what constitutes an attempt to compromise. And this is kind of like their document describing it. So our conclusion is that given the competent regulators are engaged with defining an appropriate standard for incident reporting, we recommend that the FERC-NERC revised SIP 08 definition be considered for a useful reporting in Maryland. There's also a question of how an incident is reported. The joint utility comments seem focused more on timing and the contact aspects, not the substance of the incident. So our understanding that the intention of the rulemaking requirement is to require the state and the PSC to monitor the sector risk assessment relative to Maryland. And we recommend that consideration of NERC's incident reporting framework, which requires information on incident type. That means compromise or attempt to compromise, attack vector, functional impact, and level of intrusion be considered and used in Maryland. The final point deals with zero trust architecture. And there's 4 industry concerns that have been raised in the petition for rulemaking that was prepared in connection with the requirements to have a zero trust approach to cyber. And in our submission, which you have, we summarized the concern, quoted the relative statement in the petition, and provided what we hoped was responsive comments. And we're also glad to see the Alliance for Digital Innovation sees the value of using NIST special publications. So there's 4 concerns. First, what does ZTA mean as the cybersecurity approach is unclear. Public Service Commissions want to define zero trust requirements from the more subjective definition and stated that, quote, while zero trust is, as a concept is currently a popular industry buzzword, its meaning is very subjective. So to us, if there's uncertainty, let's go to the standards organizations. And so NIST has released 2 publications on ZTA, 800 and 207, 800 to 117. And NIST has also begun to directly consider operational security from the standpoint of zero trust architecture. NERC also relies upon the same NIST approach in a 2023 white paper on zero trust, which declares, quote, zero trust offers a clear direction forward for continual improvement to securing our critical infrastructure against emerging threats to operational technology, end quote. And also the proliferation of industrial control systems malware. Consequently, it's our position that zero trust architecture, as articulated by NIST, has a sufficient clarity for zero trust architecture, and it's a coherent approach that can be known and implemented. It's possible to assess the compliance against a regulation that requires zero trust architecture, and this NIST publication describes the tenets, logical components, and generalized model for implementing ZTA. So compliance can be assessed against these principles, and we do not support the Joint Utilities contention that ZPT should not be formally addressed. Second concern they had was that ZTA displaces other cybersecurity practices that have been considered important. Well, NIST does not represent that Zero Trust is a standalone, all-in-one solution, but it's an approach that should be deployed in conjunction with the existing practices. And we agree. Third concern they mentioned was that implementation must be a journey, carefully approached with risk management. We agree. And NIST publication says the same thing. So both for public service companies and their vendors, the implementation of Zero Trust is a goal that require planning informed by risk management and other practices. So finally, the last concern was, how will compliance be assessed when there are many factors that affect the implementation? The regulation representing and implementing this statutory requirement should make clear the standard against which compliance can be assessed. And we would urge that the standard include expectation that public service companies take fundamental steps to make implementation possible. And particularly, we propose public service companies can provide evidence that they are already or planning to implement Zero Trust architecture in their IT and OT systems and provide timelines for doing so as practical. Our written submission provides suggestions. We could cover that in the subsequent discussions today. So in closing, we think the Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity Act of 2023 is an important cybersecurity cornerstone statute for the state, and that the rulemaking you're working on today is an important way of implementing that. We support the comments made by Senator Tester's office and defer to the Office of People's Counsel on the issues that we did not address. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to participate in the working group and provide these comments to you today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Alrighty. So why don't we turn next to staff? So Mr. Dean, you want to make any comments? Make as few or as many as you want. So.
Thank you. Staff filed its comments supporting adoption of the regulations. We have no further comments, but we're happy to listen to other
Sure.
suggestions.
Okay, any questions for staff? All right, Office of People's Counsel.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. OPC generally supports the proposed regulations as filed by the work group leader, but certain modifications to the compliance process to ensure adequate transparency to the Commission and the public. As explained in OPC's comments, as proposed, the enforcement process would be mostly opaque to the public and the Commission itself. OPC's proposed changes, located in Appendix A of our comments, would only require that any final enforcement decisions regarding from these regulations be approved by the Commission itself. OPC believes that these revisions properly balance the public's interest in governmental transparency with concerns about confidentiality and administrative efficiency. Thank you.
Well, any questions for, so Commissioner Richard?
Not at this time.
So just elaborate a little bit on this ability for us to, when we make a ruling or a finding, to be transparent with the public without, giving away the state secret, so to speak.
Right. So if you, essentially what we proposed is if you look at sort of the red line of what we proposed, I believe, so for example, I think I proposed 20060201E, essentially says, any proposed compliance order shall be filed with the Commission, and then underneath that, the Commission shall, that I think that the proposed compliance order can be filed confidentially. I would figure the compliance order would be filed by the Office of Cybersecurity, and if they and the utility decide to file it confidentially, then in 1E1B it says that the Commission shall determine if and when the confidential version can be filed publicly. So essentially, the Commission can make the Office of Cybersecurity can file a compliance order or proposed compliance order with the commission, file it confidentially, and then the commission can decide, is this something that can be disclosed to the public eventually, and then if so, when.
Okay, all right, thanks. Any other questions? All right, so why don't we turn to the joint utilities?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian Quinn on behalf of the Joint Utilities. I'm going to try to stay pretty high level and just go through the high points of our statement, of our comments. Although the current cybersecurity regs have been effective since July of 2022, the Commission's been active in the cybersecurity space for much longer than that. This goes back to 2017, 2018, when the Cybersecurity Work Group was first created in the AMI cases. So since that 6-year timeline, most of the joint utilities that I represent have met regularly with the Cybersecurity Work Group and continue to do so today. They're under current COMAR regulations to file incident reports, cybersecurity breach notifications to the Commission today, and they do. And the current COMAR regs were the result of a consensus building and a consensus recommendation out of the Cybersecurity Work Group a few years back. So, but I think when you actually get into the substance of our comments, you're going to hear we're not that far apart from, notwithstanding what the Cybersecurity Council said, I don't think we're far apart at all. And I'll go through and try to explain to you the points why I say that. So the first thing in our comments that we deal with are to the extent that there's a notion that this current Do It manual that Do It published at the end of last year is somehow effective today. I'm happy to address that more. I know you read our comments, but I think that Do It manual is a regulation, no matter how you slice it, and it would need to be promulgated under the APA. And also, the Do It does not have jurisdiction over public utilities. This commission does. So I think what we're doing here today is the rulemaking that was contemplated by the 2023 law that passed last year. When you look at the Delmarva case that we cite in our brief, it's pretty clear cut. So to the extent I need to address that anymore, if you have any more questions, I'm happy to address that topic. But really, so if not, I'll go on to the cyber incident reporting definition and requirements. And that's really the main thrust of our disagreement with the proposed regs. And we're really not that far off when I get into it. But and again, we're not opposed to incident reporting. We've been doing it. We do it federally to the entities that are subject to it. And we can and want to do that here in the state of Maryland as needed. But in a nutshell, we think the cybersecurity incident definition and the other language that's in the petition about how Do It sees in the Do It manual, how they see enforcing this, needs to be scoped to systems that really matter, that really have an impact on the delivery of utility service, and have a confirmed impact. So all the joint utilities operate internet-facing systems today. They all operate publicly facing systems. So the broad language in the Do It manual and staff's mention of the need to report events of interest, which you see on page 13, 12 and 13 in their petition, and in the Do It manual, page 4 and 5. With those broad descriptives, you're going to result in needless over-reporting. And we can get into the details of that as we go through the regs if you want, and we can give you some examples. But if you take nothing else from our comments, please understand there's a difference between, an important difference between incident reporting and information sharing. So incident reporting is one thing, and we're happy to do incident reporting. But information sharing is more generally related to threats, as you see. And there's entities set up today that are available for information sharing with the state and utilities, and we're happy to participate in more. What we would ask for you today is perhaps send this topic back to the work group, because we're not that far off, and we can come up with a workable definition of incident reporting that's more incident reporting and less information sharing. And we hope we leave you with that. Specifically, We object to the FISMA definition that the Do-It manual uses for cybersecurity incident because it's overly broad and would result in a deluge of reporting that ties up both our resources, your resources, and our ratepayers' resources, which are really most important here. But by adopting this outdated FISMA definition, utilities are going to be required to report potential violation of company security policies, procedures, and acceptable use policies, regardless of materiality. So regardless of whether they impact operations or not. And so the public service companies have hundreds of acceptable use policies and other internal policies that a violation of, you don't want to have to report those. You're going to be reporting phishing attempts, and you don't want to deluge. For the sake of reporting or over-reporting, you're going to have useless, needless incident reporting going to the state. We'd rather you be focused on what you're really after, which is something that puts an operational asset at risk. And we can get there. You'll hear from Mr. Maratz. There's a definition in New Jersey who went through this exact same process couple years ago that's worked well up there. We mentioned the Peters-Portman federal act that passed, but there's other language we can get to, and I think we will if we can kick that particular issue with your guidance back to the work group. So I'll just leave it there. And again, if another important aspect we want to leave you with the incident reporting is, it may make sense to report as the Do-It manual wants. Do-It, of course, is responsible for the IT systems for state agencies. And so Do-It actually helps with incident response for a state agency, Commissioner Barbary, like if the Department of Budget Management is hacked, and Do-It will actually help with the incident response. The Department of Infotechnology is not assisting the utilities with incident response here. And that's why this MITRE ATT&CK framework language doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, at the worst possible time, if there is a security breach at the utility, then we have to pull resources off that particular matter to make a report to do it at the worst possible time, and we get zero benefit, and our ratepayers get zero benefit in return, because it's not as if Do-It is helping with the incident response. So I hope we made that clear in our comments. And again, I think we can get there. And finally, one of the last points we made in our comments, if you have 1,000 incident reports a month, the state's going to be holding a bunch of data that really could be compromised. I don't know if the state wants to hold a bunch of needless data about phishing attempts when, none of that will improve cybersecurity or enhance cybersecurity practices that all of these joint utilities already implement. They're some of the biggest utilities in the country. So I think some of the law from last year was an attempt to scope out to other utilities, the water companies and other Maryland companies, public service companies that may not be as far along with cybersecurity as some of the companies that I represent here. So I hope we've made that clear. And again, if you believe there's more, a broader definition, or there's more information sharing to be done, we can kick this back to the work group and we can commit to work together. But we will need some guidance from you as we do that. Two last points, if I can quickly get to them. The attestation report. So the law from last year requires a attestation assessment to be filed by July 1 of 2024. So I'm sure you've looked at that and you're worried that we've got to pass these regulations in order to make sure we can meet that deadline. The law in and of itself establishes the July 1 deadline. We have no dispute over the assessment that the joint utilities are going to be required to make by July 1. So we can commit to do that. You don't need to pass this particular regulation, this whole set of regulations in order to do that. The joint utilities are prepared to make that July 1 filing with the guidance that staff provided in their petition. They explained how the assessment will be interpreted by them, and that works fine with us. Our only ask on that topic is if the commission could add some guidance that right now staff's, they require the assessment every 2 years to the last NERC SIP. That's critical infrastructure protection standard for the National North American Regulatory Commission. That's fine for our electric companies, but we would like you to add just some guidance there that the TSA, the current TSA gas pipeline security directives that the gas companies comply with will be similarly treated for the assessment purposes. And I don't think staff has an objection to that, but you can ask them. But that's all we really need on the assessment. So we're aligned there. And the AGA comments that are before you also sort of supplement that to the extent that you have any questions. In our own comments, we also indicate all the current federal regulation, cybersecurity regs that are applicable, like I said, and the TSA gas guidelines are one of those. And just with a little more clarity there, I think we can get aligned on that. So finally, the zero trust definition is where I'll stop. So sorry to go on so long, but it's not that we don't agree that zero trust is defined. It's a very broad definition. I've read it 16 times. I'm still not sure what it means, but it's a zero. You confirm. Yeah, it's like so we don't dispute that zero trust is important, and but even staff in their comments on page 14, what our issue is. In the OT space, for zero trust for IT, hardware and software is pretty easy to assess and to be judged upon. But for the operational technologies that we have at substations, for example, zero trust for these older substations, and it's a work in progress to get the operational systems that actually move the industrial equipment at a substation around zero trust, for what that means. So our main concern is focused on how we're going to be judged to be compliant or not, and when that compliance, in other words, if we file a remediation report, so when you go to, what I wanted to take you to is page 29 of the proposed regs, section F. It talks about a periodic review of risks, and companies are required to file remediation plans. And we're just concerned about what that is, a remediation plan regarding what, it's not clear. So we think we can get there to a place where we can have some little more discussion between staff and the companies as to what compliance looks like for zero trust, especially with operational technologies, which are these different types of equipment you have that actually work the industrial equipment of a gas delivery system and a substation, for example. So we could use a little more guidance on working out what that compliance would look like. Because what you don't want to be is out of compliance with a regulation that would be impossible to meet. In other words, some zero trust approaches aren't available or in process to be available on OT systems, and it's to be judged by threat of enforcement and civil penalties on what our compliance would look like is the concern there. So to reiterate, nobody disputes zero trust is important. It's a compliance issue that we'd like a little more time to talk to staff about. And I think we can get there. And with that, I'll stop. I know it went on a long time, but I appreciate your listening. And now I'll turn it over to Scott from the Edison Electric Institute. Thank you.
Well, actually,
Please.
so why don't you think of a couple questions? So,
Yeah.
Commissioner Sushman.
Yeah, I'm going to leave Mr. Aronson in the hot seat for a little bit longer. Sorry, Scott, this is payback time.
Bring it.
Scott and I go back a long way, and actually that's going to relate a little to my question for Mr. Quinn. So I've spent a fair amount of time in my previous life doing some of the NERC stuff, and I wanted you to talk a little bit to the commissioners, my fellow commissioners, about what's required for incident reporting under the SIP. So I'm assuming it's SIP 008. So just to kind of give us a sense of what's required there and how that relates to what's being proposed in the current regs.
Commissioner Suchman, thank you for that question. I think we talked about it a little bit in our petition, but rather than hear from me on it, If it's okay, could Jason McCormick from
Please.
First Energy, who's expert in cyber, can he respond to your question?
Please.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thanks, Commissioner. At a high level, for the NERC SIP 8 requirements, what the NERC SIP 8 requirements are generally looking at are incident reports of successful compromise, specifically of in this case, since it's dealing with NERC, bulk electric, so transmission level assets. Or if there is a attempted incident that in general is believed to have been a directed, credible, significantly serious attempt against those systems. I don't want to say it's very tight because there's some broadness to it, but it's a lot more tailored toward understanding real threats, real potential threats to the infrastructure rather than a very broad event that something happened. We were talking earlier in the lobby, and Scott had made the example of a criminal trying to just jiggle the doorknob versus a motivated person who's trying to break into your house with a ski mask and a crowbar. Even if they fail, something like that's reportable. We're really looking with the NERC definitions. We really want to make sure that we're focusing on the serious threats that matter, not just everything, because there's a lot of things, as Mr. Quinn mentioned, an internet-facing company, we get hit by what we call drive-by attacks every day. They're just defeated because of how they are, right? They're not interesting. They don't present a significant threat to things. So that's why we're very interested in those types of narrowing of the definition.
Okay, and then when you, and I'm going to ask you to sort of compare that to what's being proposed today, but if you can stay with the NERC example, so the incident is reported to NERC or to the regions, to both? And then also, what's involved in the reporting? What kinds of data do you provide?
Yeah, so there's sort of two paths that could take, Commissioner. One is if it definitely falls into the category of a disturbance of the electric system, that falls into a Department of Energy and OE 417, which is an official federal report. In general, if those happen, then the NERC required reporting that goes along with that, such as to EISAC and to the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, would use that same information.
You have to explain to my fellow commissioners what ESISAC.
Oh, I'm sorry. EISAC is the Electricity Information Sharing Coordination Group. So, like Mr. Quinn mentioned, there are industry groups that deal with the information sharing aspect of cybersecurity rather than regulatory reporting. So in that example, we would be providing some of the basic informations of a confirmed or a confirmed attempted incident that deals with what was the potential impact, how many potential customers, how many customers were affected, was there different characteristics of impact, or what was the potential for that impact. It's very narrowly tailored to impact and risk.
And do you provide any critical infrastructure information to NERC or to DOE at the time that you do the reporting?
I wouldn't think that would be typical, no.
Okay. And then, so can you compare what you do on the bulk power system reporting to what's being proposed for the state level reporting?
You're specifically referring to the new proposal?
Yes, for the Maryland proposal.
Just wanted to clarify. Yeah, so our concerns with that are very similar, or come from how Mr. Quinn put it, is it's very broad. Our biggest concern.
So your concern is the language is too broad.
Yes, ma'am. So, for example, the way it's written, how we interpret it, and how we interpret how we're going to be assessed on compliance, would result in a very broad amount of reporting of things that would be, in our professional opinion, very trivial, not worth reporting to the point where we would be just churning out lots of reports that really don't provide meaningful information on risk. Like, we're happy to share incident reports, things that, hey, this was a risk we ran into, this was a threat, this is a real threat actor. Our concern is that the way it's written is so broad that we would be compelled to report pieces of information that really don't benefit anybody. Us generating them, people receiving them, it's just sort of the business as usual aspect of things that we're concerned about. But was that helpful, or did I hit on what you're looking for?
Yeah, no, I'm processing, but yeah, can an argument be made that because we're dealing with the distribution system, that things are different at the distribution level as opposed to the bulk power system level, so that incidents that might not be a big deal at the transmission level become bigger at the distribution level. So that the kinds of reporting, it would necessarily be different. That you'd want that, perhaps following in Mr. Aronson's example, maybe the person jiggling the doorknob might not be important at the transmission level because the transmission system is so big and it wouldn't have an impact, but at the distribution level, because the voltages are lower, that jiggling might actually have an impact and could be a situation that's more important to be reported. And that's just, sort of a hypothetical.
Yeah, Commissioner, I think with that, it is much larger, right? I mean, that's definitely not in dispute. I think that the issue, though, is less about the size, but still more of that targeted, what's a real threat or risk to some of this infrastructure. It is larger in scope, right? In terms of the number of, for example, we're an electric utility, in the terms of the number of substations and different pieces, parts. We have lots of those types of things. But in a lot of cases with those types of systems, the types of reporting and the type of analysis that we would do would be similar, just at a different scale of things. So we would still be worried about, let's say if we have two theoretical attacks, A and B, one is made directly against, for example, a distribution control system versus something on the public internet or a random fish. They're still not really equivalent, even though distribution has a much larger footprint. We take a risk-based approach with making sure that we're spending time on those events of interest, to use the term that's in the legislation. We want to make sure that we're spending time on the things that really could turn into that type of risk, rather than just try to process everything at the same level, because for us it's just not at that same level. Everything is not equal in that scenario.
That's all I have.
Commissioner Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn, and
Sure.
for all the people you brought in to help inform us on this important topic.
Sure.
And I was pleased to hear that you say at this point in the process you're not far off, because I think it is important that we arrive at consensus positions on this critical and emerging threat. But I did want to better understand the position of the utilities, the joint utilities, with regards to DO IT and the Maryland Cybersecurity Council. You stated at the beginning of your remarks that, one, reminding us that we're independent and we're not subject necessarily to these entities, but they are, we're not subject necessarily to MDE, and the utilities aren't directly regulated by MDE or PPI. I wanted to say DNR. I'm sorry, I can't say it after this afternoon. But we look to the expertise of these agencies to both reflect the policies of the state and their areas as we set, as we regulate utilities. So why wouldn't the Cybersecurity Council and DO IT be important guiding entities in the state for us as we attempt to set state policy and regulation for our utilities?
Gotcha. Thank you, Commissioner Richard. Yeah, what I meant by that was the Do It manual. So I agree with you. The Department of Infotechnology and the Cybersecurity Council work with the Cybersecurity Work Group today, and they do have input there, and that's what we're doing in front of you with this rulemaking. What I was referring to there is the Do It manual. They seem I don't know if this is their position 100% or not, but it seems like they're claiming the do it manual that was attached to the staff's petition is in force today, immediately, by immediate effect. And it's titled, it's at the end of staff's petition, you'll see there's a do it manual attached. It says the do it manual applies to public utilities today. And they just implemented a manual and published it. And you heard Mr. McCormick talk about some of the language they use in there that's extremely broad, exfiltration and all this stuff that he was talking about. So to the extent that the do it manual, there's some claim out here that the do it manual is somehow applicable today to utilities. That's what I meant. I hope you'll understand we disagree with that. The do it manual is a regulation that would need to be promulgated through the APA process. So you can ask do it, they're here today, but to the extent that there's an argument that that manual's applicable to the utilities today, that was my point. You can't just produce a manual, I understand what the statute says from last year, and say this is now applicable to utilities. That's not how agency rulemaking works. And in fact, the evidence of that is what we're doing here today, which is we're actually discussing proposed regs that staff prepared that are to the COMAR section applicable to public utilities, and that's what we're actually doing today. So I hope I clarified what I meant by that.
Okay.
Absolutely,
But should we be informed by it? I mean, if this, and again, I don't know what the plan is for the manual, but if it's to help set state policy, and we're in a position now where we're trying to set regulation for our utilities. I mean, I almost hear you saying we should discount it, or what weight should we be giving it? Because in a sense, if that's what we have to look to for state policy and from our experts.
I understand.
So I'm just trying to.
Yeah, understood, Mr. Commissioner Richard. I'm not saying disregard it. We have comments that we have in our petition where we point out some arguments as to why we disagree with some of the proposals in the Do It manual that may be more appropriate if we were a sister state agency, for example, and they were helping us respond to incident or cyber attacks. But that's not what's going on here. Respectfully, we just think the Do It manual, it uses language that Jason described, and we can go in further detail if you want, but it's about phishing attempts, and you're going to have any jiggling of the door of the front door would be an incident required to be reported. And what we're telling you is we think that's a little broad. You're going to get 1,000 reports a month from the utilities under the Do It manual's language as we read it, and we just don't think that's a good use of our resources or our ratepayers' resources. But you, the commission, make the decision on that question. But absolutely don't disregard it. We just have issues with it that we think we could use your help with some guidance, kicking this back to the work group if you so choose to do that.
Okay. Is this analogous at all to, I mean, the process we went through for setting reliability standards over the last decade or so? I mean, it has been an iterative process, and we set regulations, and then it's evolved over time. Again, in Maryland, we've set higher standards than a lot of states with reliability, and this may be the same thing here for cybersecurity, that our leaders in Annapolis want us to set the highest of standards. So again, how can we reflect that and do it expeditiously, as I think we're being instructed from Annapolis to do, but to again, obviously we want this to, I would like to see it come to some consensus, but again, I personally will look very heavily toward Do It and my Maryland Cybersecurity Council to help guide us as we get that.
Perfectly understood and understand your point. But again, that's your decision to make. We hope we've raised some arguments for you to think about. If you want to have 1,000 incident reports a month going to the state, and what the utility of that will be, the usefulness of that will be, and you want to spend ratepayer funds on staff at the utilities to make these types of reports. If you think that's we're just raising that issue. We just don't think there's a lot of benefit for those types of incident reports. And as you heard, you're going to get a lot of incident reports a month. And if you get reporting for reporting's sake isn't enhancing cybersecurity procedures at the utilities. Just that's what the message we wanted to leave you with. These companies are concerned with cyber every day, every minute, every second of every day. So please just consider our comments while you make the decision on whether or not you want to just adopt the do it manual whole cloth, or if you think some of the comments we made. And I think we can get there. You know, it was encouraging to hear the Cybersecurity Council talk about NERC CIP 8. That's something we could probably work with, and that would be a useful incident reporting standard. Or you may hear from Mr. Morales about what they do in New Jersey. So we just think the do it manual isn't quite ready for prime time. Maybe if we were another state agency it would be, but it's certainly not applicable today pursuant to the Delmarva case that I cited as a regulation. So Commissioner Richard, 100%, this is your call, and we hope we will, you'll listen to our comments and concerns and take them into consideration as well.
Oh, yeah, and absolutely,
Yeah.
I do weigh the, all parties' comments. I just wanted to make sure I understood the position of the utilities with regard to the other state agencies, and you understood, at least where I'm coming from, that these are agencies that set state policy, and they have their own areas of expertise that I believe this commission will listen to. So I'm hopeful that you will work to arrive at some level of consensus. Also, I was pleased that I used to call him President Moroz when he was in New Jersey, but I know New Jersey has also been a leader, and I believe Maryland is also. Both states leaders in cybersecurity, so I will be interested if he's here to talk to us on how, what they've been doing, how they've been progressing with cybersecurity in New Jersey, and how that might parallel with what we're trying to do. So
You've heard enough from me, Commissioner, that's for sure. But yes, Rick's on the line to speak. I think Scott was going to go next,
Okay.
but happy to answer any additional questions.
No, thank you very much. I
Thank you,
appreciate
sir.
it. Thank you.
Commissioner Barbie.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to very briefly have you expand upon this whole zero trust concept, because in my readings here and in just general reading of this concept broadly, it always struck me more as a philosophy or a strategy rather than do this, 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 and this. Am I wrong about that, or are we going to actually attempt to implement specific procedures that will embody the zero trust philosophy?
Commissioner Barbie, I'm going to ask one of our experts to respond, but you're on the right track there. You're right. It's more of an approach than a specific. Even you read the definition in the law. It's to me.
I did, yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's where we're at. We're at the compliance question there.
Okay.
And I think maybe Jason or Scott Timkins from First Energy may be able to provide a little more color.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Commissioner. You were spot on. I think you have a future in cybersecurity consulting, if you're ever interested. But
How much do they pay?
Zero trust is exactly that. It is a concept, a set of principles that are recommended, including in the NIST standards, to guide an organization to better protect their critical assets. It is not a list of specific requirements or checkboxes that you can go down through and say, we meet this, we meet that. And I think to Joint Utility Council's point, the concern there is as each of the utilities move toward a zero trust architecture concept, how will we be judged on whether or not we are compliant with what the commission desires?
Okay. I understand. Thank you. All right. One other question. Maybe you're the correct person to ask about this. The jiggling of the doorknob versus a serious intrusion into 1, 2, or 3 levels of security protocol, of security buffers. So how is that quantified? I'm just curious to know how you are able to distinguish these things, because I completely agree that we shouldn't be doing 1,000 or reports a month, because it'll just get buried, but I want to be assured that we have a proper systematic approach to distinguishing between the doorknob jiggle and the stick of dynamite blowing open the door. You know, what is the describe to me what the methodology is for being able to distinguish between those things.
Agreed. And I will reiterate Mr. Quinn's point. I think that the working group should reconvene and discuss on coming to consensus on a definition. I will tell you that in the NERC CIP 8 standards, our company, as do the other utilities that must comply with those standards, set up a program and define exactly what constitutes a cybersecurity incident and an attempt at a cybersecurity incident, and we utilize those definitions to then make a determination on whether or not those individual events should be reported to both EISAC or DHS CISA. If you're looking for,
so it's an evolving methodology. It's as these successful or semi-successful intrusions occur, the definition is on a national basis refreshed so that we have an understanding of what the nature of this threat is.
NERC CIP 8 does not give you a specific bright line definition on what constitutes a cybersecurity incident.
Okay.
Each utility defines that in their program and then is subject to review by the ERO in First Energy. For the entire state of Maryland, that regulating entity is Reliability First, that conducts those audits and reviews the program and makes a determination based on guidance from NERC on whether or not that program is compliant.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm good.
Oh, actually, yeah, so go ahead.
Right. So this is the challenge with us. Somebody asks a question and makes us think about a question that we thought should have asked before, but we didn't. So, so in talking about zero trust and the fact that there's not a really good definition of what zero trust is, I mean, NERC has been working over the last, almost 20 years at trying to figure out at least what constitutes an activity that's not trustworthy. So you're not allowed to take a laptop to Europe and plug it in there and then bring it back and plug it back into an outlet in the control center. You have restrictions on who can gain access. So you cast these perimeters that restrict what activity can go on and who can gain access. And so it's hard for me to imagine that there's not an opportunity to take advantage of all the good work that NERC has done. And at least within Maryland, we don't have to restrict what zero trust means only because the black hats every day come up with a new way of infiltrating the system. So it has to be organic and it has to continue to be evolving, but at least give general parameters as opposed to saying, well, we can't really define it because it's so vague and so broad. I mean, I think at a minimum you can give at least broad parameters on what you mean by sort of identifying the kinds of people that should not be gaining access to certain facilities and the kinds of hardware that shouldn't be plugged in. So do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, Commissioner Suchman, yeah, and that's the type of discussion we need to have back at the work group,
Okay.
so we can present you guys with a little more detail. That's not in these proposed regulations.
Okay,
What you're
because I
talking
think
about.
that would be very helpful
Information.
to whoever
Yes,
is
ma'am.
looking at it. So, I mean, NERC's done a really good job because they've had 20 plus years to do it, of trying to figure out who should not be where. And so we shouldn't be starting from scratch at the distribution level. We should at least look to what NERC's done, and to the extent that we need to tailor it to what we're doing, that's fine. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the zero trust definition. Yeah, it doesn't really work for me either. So to the extent that we can find a way to have a better definition of what that means, and within the definitions is also an expectation. I mean, what is it that we expect from behaviors, and that sort of plays into what zero trust, I think, should be.
It's not a question, but couldn't agree more. Commissioner Suchman, thank you. And
you.
that's the type of discussion and guidance we needed to take back to the work group, hopefully. And again, we've discussed this for a while at the work group level, and had back and forth with Do It and others, and this is the regulation that came out, and so we just think respectfully it needs a little more work, and appreciate your comments.
So, in your earlier comments, you made some concerns about the remediation reports that might be required, and I guess the sort of lack of clarity as to what was required. And along the lines of what Commissioner Richard had talked about regarding the reliability requirements and standards that we have for, non-cyber incidents. I mean, there's a process within those regulations for the utilities to provide remediation reports for when things are found wrong with the distribution system that's not cyber related. I mean, isn't this essentially requiring the same sort of action on your part?
Mr. Chairman, great question. I'm not sure. I mean, when you read the reg, it says remediation plans, and it's unclear what that's referring to. Is it referring to some kind of finding the commission makes that we were out of compliance with zero trust, and then we file a remediation plan? Is it a fulfilling remediation plan that goes along with all of our assets? We just need a little clarity there that I think we can come to with a further discussion at the work group level, I hope. But I'm not sure what the remediation plan language means in that particular section. You can read it in a lot of different ways.
Okay, all right. So you want to turn now to...
Very brief, thanks for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
So go right ahead. So.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioner Suchman, and the rest of the commissioners. No offense, Commissioner Suchman and I go way back. So the problem with going second and being in the hot seat a little bit longer is now there's a lot to react to. So the first thing that I wanted to do is to thank the Commission for the time today, and to very closely align myself with Mr. Quinn and the Joint Utilities submission. A couple of themes that I'll pull on. I don't want to be redundant or repetitive, but I do want to pull on a couple of threads. Since I do love a good analogy, the analogy of jiggling the doorknobs came up, I want to maybe reflect on that a little bit more as well as we go along. The first thing I want to do is say, look, cybersecurity is a team sport, and we are all on the same team. Critical infrastructure is critical because it's critical to national security. It's critical to the life, health, and safety of the communities that we serve. And so making sure that we are aligned is incredibly important. I think to the point that Mr. Quinn made, we're very close in where we are and where we're trying to go. Transparency and accountability is important. We want to be able to share that information so that we can all effectively defend respective networks. I think there is a really important distinction between, and we've talked about it in terms of IT and OT, information technology and operational technology, sure, but also just between electric companies and public utilities, as well as state agencies and others who operate information technology systems. There's not a one-for-one where if we do this in the IT space, we should do this in the OT space. And so we have to be very careful about that. And then the other goal is to have secure and affordable critical infrastructure. And affordability, I know, is a top priority of all of you, and it is of the electric companies that EEI is privileged to represent. So one of the things I wanted to juxtapose is this concept of information sharing versus information reporting or incident reporting. They're not the same thing. And Mr. Draffin made an important point about Volt Typhoon, which was a set of malware from China that is targeting critical infrastructure. If you go back to the worldwide threat assessment that the Director of National Intelligence does every year, ever since 2019 in unclassified space, they have said that near-peer nation states like China and Russia are looking to target U.S. Critical infrastructure to hold us at risk at a time of their choosing. If they're saying that in unclassified space, you can imagine what the classified information is. What's really interesting, the reason I bring this up is Volt Typhoon, which became very public in mid-February, was not a surprise to the electric sector because information had been shared, and not just that, electric companies of all stripes, not just the investor-owns, but the co-ops, the munis, the Canadians, we are an interconnected grid, independent power generators, had actually been part of a process to develop mitigation strategies against that threat even before it became public. So you see that there's a lot happening beneath the surface with respect to cyber information sharing that will never be fixed with incident reporting. Incident reporting, back to this concept of affordable electricity, accountability, given your jobs to hold electric companies to account, transparency for understanding what it is and why we are making these investments, that's where incident reporting comes in. But information sharing for states and for public utilities is something that is already happening in a lot of different ways. I would also, we've talked about the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, EISAC. There's also the multi-state ISAC, and every other critical sector has an Information Sharing and Analysis Center. They are working together collectively to identify these risks and share them. So let's not confuse information sharing with incident reporting. The other concept I wanted to raise is harmonization. And this goes to affordability. This goes to not having more people doing incident reporting and not doing defense of their networks. The priority needs to be network defense, not filling out paperwork. And I'm not suggesting that that's what this is an exercise in, but I want to be very clear. The National Cyber Strategy, President Biden's last year, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, which passed last year, and which the rule, 447 pages of it, was just made public today. The Department of Energy and NARUC, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, are working collaboratively to harmonize reporting requirements, to harmonize federal and state, so that we are all rowing in the same direction. Yes, there is a distinction between federal issues and bulk electric system issues, very well tended to by the Federal Power Act and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but the states have a role to play here too, and I appreciated the question about the difference between transmission systems, bulk electric systems, and distribution systems. That said, it's all the same system. There isn't a bright line, per se, between bulk electric and distribution. Where there is to this concept of prioritization and risk. There is priority and risk for things at the distribution level. Systems that support other critical sectors, systems that support military installations. Those could be at the distribution level. The bulk electric system level, you're talking about much broader impacts. So I'm fond of saying, another analogy for you, you protect diamonds like diamonds, you protect pencils like pencils, and we need to have that prioritization and risk-based approach to the way that we not just defend systems, but also report on what is happening to them. With respect to the proposed rule, I'll hit just a couple of concerns specifically that I have in seeing it. And again, I think Mr. Quinn did a really good job of explaining the joint utilities perspective on them. It's about extrapolating signal from noise and the jiggling of doorknobs. So if we think about it in terms of SIP 8, Critical Infrastructure Protection Standard number 8 from NERC, the reason why Reliability First and other state and other agencies have a set of rules around SIP 8 is, first, Commissioner Richard, iterative is exactly the right word. Threats are changing, the grid is changing, the regulations and oversight and reporting requirements for them ought to evolve as well. Second, one of the things that NERC got particularly right in its 20 plus years of being the electric reliability organization is to take input from the owners and operators to develop what is more than just jiggling the doorknob. What is the person with the mask on and the crowbar with a persistent threat? The words that come to mind for me are if it is targeted, if it is persistent, if it has a role, if it has the potential for operational impact, if it is clearly a threat to the theft of personally identifiable information or intellectual property. Absolutely, those are reportable. So there are ways to define this, but those ways need to be iterative, and they need to be a collective industry and government, industry and regulator process to develop those rules. Signal and noise. So that jiggling of doorknobs, we've heard the word 1,000 a month. I'm afraid it's millions a month. I mean, you're talking about the potential for, the problem with cyber is it scales really well, and these are usually crimes of opportunity. So it is about jiggling the doorknob, finding the place where I can then gain access, then doing bad things. That happens literally millions of times per day, but we don't hear about it because it doesn't matter. But persistence, threat to actual operations, from indicators of compromise that show a sophisticated threat actor, that's a different story. And that is what we need to be doing to separate signal from noise. We can talk about what is an incident. It's, the sort of philosophical question of how many angels dance on the head of a pin. I think we could all have a definition for it. I'm not going to pretend to be able to give you one here. The last thing I'll say with respect to the concerns about this particular rule, the resources that go into reporting versus defending, I want to foot stomp that. And I will say, speed is important when you're talking about cyber. And interestingly, I may say something that's a little contradictory. 24 hours is doable. I know that there's a reporting requirement here of 24 hours if we define what it is. So not thousands of things, and if we're defining what needs to be reported. The question came up about whether or not some of these reports are made public. SIP-8 is not made public. OE-417s are, but only after a period of time. I think one of the things that EEI responded to, you may be familiar with the new Securities and Exchange Commission reporting requirements regarding materiality, again, about accountability and transparency, because the general public needs to know if an electric company or anybody else may have been compromised in a way that could impact shareholder value. There has to be exemptions for national security, and there has to be exemptions for public safety. And rest assured, adversaries are looking at, sophisticated adversaries are looking at the impact of their attack, signaling that the thing that they did had impact, or signaling the thing that they did not have impact because of an omission of a report, is a lot of information for them to have a more successful attack against critical infrastructure. So we have to be very careful that incident reporting doesn't have a contradictory effect, or that may ultimately impact national security. So the last thing I'll say is just kind of careful what you ask for. I think millions of data points are not terribly useful. We need signal from that noise. Protecting that information from a national security perspective then falls on the commission or the state. That's not a good place to be. I think there are a lot of ways that we can do this. Again, back to my first statement of cyber being a team sport. We're all on the same team. How do we do this effectively so you can do your jobs and the electric companies sitting here today and across the country can do theirs? Thank you.
So, any questions?
Thank you.
How could I not?
I-
Okay, so I guess the first question I have is, on some level, you and we have not done our jobs if there's an incident that has to be reported, and because at that point, I mean, assuming that we're not doing the noise, we're not doing the jiggling, but we're actually doing sort of a real incursion. Something's happened, and so I guess, I mean, I've been a little bit concerned about what's being put together. I think I've talked to Mr. Brukowski about this. That the focus, and what's good about the NERC standards is that they address the things that you need to do to prevent the incursion. So it's identifying the zero trust portion, so that NERC and FERC can be assured that utilities, at least at the bulk power system, are doing the things that they need to do to prevent cyber incursions. And we don't have that if we're only looking at having incidents reported, because we're not getting to the place where we can prevent them from happening, which I think is the more important piece. Because once something happens and you're reporting, whether you're reporting the noise or you're reporting the signals, or however you want to sort of distinguish it, we've got a lot of the things that the Exelon companies, for example, are required to do under NERC. I'm assuming spill down to the distribution level. So all of the things that you're doing, and there's not a bright line between transmission, distribution. I've heard more than one time FERC saying, oh, we can regulate all the way to the toaster. So it may be that so much of what is contained within NERC sort of comes down to the distribution level anyway. But how do we, as commissioners, have any assurances that the kinds of protections that are in place for the bulk power system are also in place at the distribution level? Because if all we're getting are incident reports, and it doesn't matter if we're getting them because it's been a failure or a success, we don't know why those happened, and if they were successful, why were they successful? So how do we can't know that all of the necessary tools are in place to make sure that company is protected, and that's particularly the case for the entities that are not subject to the NERC standards. So the gas utilities, the water utilities, and so I guess I'm throwing that out. I don't know. Is Mr. Aronson, is this a softball for you?
I don't know if it's a softball. I want to say a couple of things, and I expect Mr. Quinn may want to as well. First of all, I disagree with the statement that if something happens, that either you as regulators or electric companies failed. That may be provocative, but a sophisticated adversary is going to be successful.
Well, but the problem is we don't actually know if we failed or not. If we don't have eyes on what's in place at the utility level to deal with cyber, then we can't actually know if it was a failure on our part or the utility's part, or if there's just a really sophisticated guy that's found another way to get into the system.
Yeah, Commissioner Suchma, I asked the same question you did preparing for this hearing. To the extent that you think there's some kind of donut hole of trouble out there, the cybersecurity assessments that are proposed in the proposed regulation, I think, will address what you're talking about, making sure you have it's an independent third-party assessment that's required by these regs on page 45 of staff's petition, that I think addresses what you're talking about, making sure that the utilities have, when you read, it's a pretty robust regulation here, about every 2 years, there needs to be an independent third party perform an assessment of periodic assessment of cybersecurity devices and supply chain and assets. So there is an assessment provision here proposed that we frankly agree with. So I think we're aligned with you there on the water. I can't speak to, but I think with the TSA gas and the NERC SIP language that staff provided for clarity, I think that goes to addressing what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
And the only other thing I'd add to this, so the assessments, which I'm not as familiar with in each state, right, but that certainly is something that NERC has done effectively with audits and being able to continually evolve. Commissioner Sussman, you remember back when we started talking about this, it was, I think we were on NERC SIP version 5, and some of the folks on Capitol Hill in DC asked, why are you on version 5? Why didn't you get it right the first time?
Yeah.
And after I got my head out of my hands, I explained that the grid is changing and the threat is changing, and so if I'm in this business long enough, I look forward to being on NERC SIP version 15, or whatever the number is going to be. Iterative, threats are changing. To your point about the grid changing, transmission versus distribution, that lack of bright line is getting even fuzzier as we have more distributed resources and more third parties connecting to the system. And I do think we need to be looking at continuing to iterate not just on security protocols and mandates for those entities and for all electric companies, but also iterating on how we assess their readiness. And I think reporting is a part of that so that we can QA/QC what we've done in the past, but I think it's also about working collectively to look forward.
Okay, so I'm just changing gears a little bit. Sort of the value of the EISAC has just, it's hard to quantify the value of that, but the focus there is really just on the bulk power system. Given that you're a trade association, are there efforts to do sort of similar exercise at the distribution level? Because I'm assuming that that a lot of the same kinds of issues at the distribution level in terms of cyber and cyber incursion are happening, and is there an opportunity for states to be able to share sort of either lessons learned or potential challenges? So be good for us to learn if something is going on in another state.
So the answer is yes. Individual states sometimes have really good working groups among their electric companies and other critical infrastructure providers within that state. I would also push back a little bit. The ISAC, yes, because it resides at NERC, is a little bit more federal, national, bulk electric focused, but not exclusively. And there's a lot of really good information that is shared between and among that growing community because it's growing in importance. And I think the ISAC is doing an extraordinary job of continuing to kind of evolve to meet this growing risk at all levels of the system. I will brag on one specific region that I think is doing something particularly interesting and well, and that is NECPUC, the Northeast Council of Public Utility Commissions, brought together some electric companies in the Northeast, New England, with a number of regulators in that region who have high-level clearances and are working with the military to make sure that facilities in that region are better protected at the distribution level. So that's one very specific example. There's a lot of different, and I just can't speak knowledgeably to all of them, but that's one that comes to mind of a really interesting opportunity for regulators and owners and operators in a classified setting and in a private setting to talk with each other in ways that are more constructive than maybe regulatory proceedings can be, where it's a little bit more adversarial.
Right, and I'm assuming the regulators all have top secret?
There are a few, it just happened that there are a few in New England that had some high levels of clearance.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Commissioner Barbe. I'm fine. Commissioner Richard.
Just the fact that the EEI is here, so there's obviously interest, I guess, in what we're doing in Maryland. Do you find the process similar to what's happening elsewhere in the country? I feel right now pretty good as a Maryland regulator because I see part of the governor's cabinet and especially legislatively created entities related to cybersecurity. So that obviously, as I've expressed, is important to me and gives me a sense that we're on the right track as far as trying to set policy in our jurisdiction. But do you have concerns about the way we're doing this in Maryland? You mentioned the word harmonization. Maybe you could just help enlighten me as like how are we doing in Maryland from an EEI perspective?
I
have
appreciate
concerns with our harmonization.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the questions. I wouldn't say I have concerns. I have interest in what all the different states are doing. I also serve I'm a steering committee member of that DOE NARUC initiative on developing cybersecurity baselines, actually with Commissioner Moroz, who you'll hear from in a moment, if I ever shut up. I think that I think that what you are doing is very aligned with a lot of states. I think a lot of state regulators and policymakers are looking at, as we talked about before, the grid is evolving. There is more happening at the distribution level. And so states want to make sure that they are doing the right thing to protect the critical infrastructure that you oversee. And I think your willingness to entertain some input from the private sector, I think I'll keep picking on the word that you used before of iterative, I think is exactly right. And I think recognizing that we can't protect everything from everything all of the time. But that there are good things that we can do collectively to address this emerging and growing risk is very much aligned with everybody else. The last thing I'll say is I do have concerns about there's sort of two ends of the spectrum, right? One end of the spectrum is 56 different states and territories doing 56 different things. That isn't helpful from an efficiency standpoint. I don't think it buys down risk. The other end of the spectrum is that everything happens at the federal level, and I don't think that's right either, because it's not a top-down. Each state has unique risk profiles, risk tolerances, regulate for different things for different reasons, and that's why we have a bulk electric versus distribution rubric, and that's a good thing. So how do we take those two ends of the spectrum and find something that's in between that leverages federal capabilities and that national security responsibility and pair that with the role that states and state regulators have to play as economic regulators, as regulators of the risk you guys are willing to sort of hold in any given state, and make sure that we're balancing those two things. And that's why I think that DOE NARUC project is so important.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, I like the fact that you said we are all on the same team, and I hopefully we were learning from other states, but I also feel like we're Team Maryland, and we have set certain standards in some areas may be higher than national standards. And so while I hear your point about harmonization, I'd also like to make sure that within our state policy of cybersecurity is harmonized so that we have maybe utilities off doing something different than other parts of our infrastructure. So anyway, thank you for being here today.
My privilege.
So the one thing I've heard about the problem with cybersecurity is, and it's not just related to utilities, but across the board, is this constant war between setting up levels of protection and the various things you can do to secure the system, and the fact that the nefarious folks are constantly figuring out how to evade those things, and so there's this evolving process of protection and subterfuge. And the problem I'm seeing is that even though in these regulations we talk about a set review by an outside entity to give us information on what's going on and make suggestions, this is not a quick process for us to do. I mean, this rulemaking process we go through takes a fair amount of time, even if everybody's in agreement. And so are there examples that you're aware of that are sort of like, I don't know, self-actuating, where, protections are integrated quick enough to sort of keep pace with the bad guys, I guess?
Yeah, you ask a really important question, so I'll say it this way. Security is not a check-the-box exercise, right? Okay, I've done X, Y, and Z, I'm secure. No, you're complacent, and you've telegraphed what your defenses are. So this concept of regulation being the answer to security broadly and cybersecurity specifically, it's not. Now, that's not to say, this may surprise you, it may not, EEI supports regulations for cybersecurity at both the federal and state level. There are reasons that you want to have, the simple way to put it is, if you mandate that I put a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversary simply brings a 12-foot ladder. But the point is, I want to make them bring that 12-foot ladder. I don't want them to be able to use their C or their D game. I want them to have to bring the A or their B game. These are crimes of opportunity. So let's not pretend that regulations equate to total security, but they are an important baseline to put in place. That's one set of statements. The other is around adversaries. I mentioned Volt Typhoon and the mitigation strategies that came out. That is, it was what's known as a 0-day. It exploited some novel techniques. There's no regulation in the world that's ever going to be fast enough to address that risk. But the electric industry, who has not just an obligation, but a desire to protect its systems, because if our systems aren't operational, we don't have a business. They have a vested interest in being responsive to those things. So I think, on the one hand, having regulations and reporting and a process, an accountability process, sets up a set of level of security that forces the adversary to bring that 12-foot ladder. And then on the other hand, having these voluntary organizations where industry is working collectively and with government and with the private sector and other sectors to be prepared for those incidents, so that when something, a novel zero-day risk becomes known, they can react to it. And then the last thing I'll say is, and when all of those things fail, we need to be resilient as well. And that's the ability to operate in a degraded state. Maybe it's not pretty, maybe we're holding the grid together with bubble gum and duct tape, but we are doing that in service to national security, health and safety of the communities, and recognizing that we will be able to reconstitute the system, because we do it after every storm also. There are a lot of different things that we can learn from the physical space that also apply to cyberspace.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, you want to turn to Mr. So, do you want to pull him up?
Rick Moraz,
Yeah.
if he's still there.
But we can't hear him though.
Okay. Go ahead, President Mraz.
Can you hear me?
Yes, actually we can. So go right ahead.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, thanks, commissioners. It's good to see a number of familiar faces and appreciate you allowing me to talk about these important issues. And thank you for the opportunity to do this virtually. By coincidence, I'm here in Philadelphia at a National Governors Association meeting speaking about these very issues that you're deliberating over today. So I apologize for not being there in person, otherwise would have been. Appreciate the opportunity to give some additional thoughts, and quite frankly, given the comments you've already heard, I'll be reiterating a number of them, but just giving you a couple of insights into how New Jersey dealt with these issues while I served as the president of the Board of Public Utilities. I served as the president from 2014 to 18, and it was in 2016 that we issued a cybersecurity order, which was at the time the first public utility commission in the country to issue a cybersecurity specific directive to the regulated companies, and that was to our electric, gas, and water companies in the state. Since then, I chaired NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee, advisor now, since I've left the commission, to Protect Our Power, a national advocacy organization on cybersecurity protection of the grid. And I am a member of the working group that Scott just mentioned, the NARUC Cybersecurity Baseline Working Group, which I think that just a couple weeks ago issued a series of baseline foundational recommendations to any public utility commission to ensure cybersecurity for the electric industry. I commend you, the commissioners, the staff, and the Maryland public policymakers, your legislature, for providing direction. As recognized by Commissioner Richards, it's good to see that Maryland takes these issues so seriously, as there are some states that have not. So I commend you for that. But today I'd just like to reiterate a few matters that largely that you've already heard from my perspectives. The first is, as you've heard already outlined by the commentators, the proposed rules, while well-intentioned, may actually be challenging, particularly on reporting, divert some resources during a crisis particularly, and might be ultimately costly or impractical. From our experience in New Jersey, and as I said in 2016 when we issued that cybersecurity directive, it was the product of a long and collaborative effort between board staff, our PUC, the Board of Public Utility staff, and the industry. There were a series of meetings to discuss the very issues or kinds of issues that you're deliberating over today. We spent much time with the industry to hear what was workable, practical, while ensuring a robust reporting system, as well as an information sharing system, and a process that still endures today. In fact, the director of the state's Fusion Center, our information sharing center, was here at this session today, and we talked about these very issues. There was a bifurcation in New Jersey under our directives that would ensure reporting of incidents, and separately to ensure information sharing, which was required under the order because we required our regulated companies to join the then new Fusion Center, the then new information sharing center. And that was for all utilities, not just the electric companies, to do that, along with, by the way, other industry representatives in the banking, in the pharmaceutical, in the transportation, and in the financial services industry. So given the concerns that you've heard today, I would encourage you to consider giving additional time for the exchange of issues on these issues that would likely lead to a robust reporting and workable regime that's practical and effective. And I also want to reiterate something that you heard today, which has to do with regimes that are already in place, and particularly for the utility group that is made comments today that this would impact for the electric companies, and particularly for companies that are already reporting incidents either through the federal regimes or otherwise. And this is particularly an issue for those companies that are multi-state, have multi-state jurisdictional operations. They're already reporting either under other regimes or frameworks, or, as you've already discussed, for the federal reporting. I would suggest that you could use the existing reporting requirements, leverage them, and make sure that they're not either duplicative or redundant or costly or burdensome. The last thing I'd like to mention, though, is in that vein and the consideration of something that is effective and aligns with others, and I think Scott touched on this, and it has to do with a recognition of not having a patchwork of requirements across the country. It was that very issue that was a foundational discussion from the NARUC working group that just issued the baseline recommendations a few weeks ago, which was to avoid having 50 separate reporting regimes, 50 separate requirements under cybersecurity. And it was that issue that we recognized that while the individual states have the latitude to adopt the requirements along with their companies that work for them, they should still try to avoid having duplicative or burdensome regulations or reporting requirements. So for that reason also, I would suggest that it's worth you giving additional consideration to the concerns that have been raised and try to align the work that's already being done by the industry, maybe being done also with other states or federal partners, and leverage that to ensure that you have a robust reporting system that protects the critical infrastructure of the state and ultimately the people of the state of Maryland. Thank you for allowing me to give these comments, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Richard.
Thank you, President Moroz, for being here. Appreciate your insights as to how it worked out, how it's working out in New Jersey. I guess I don't really have any questions. Just if you have any comments on where we are. I mean, as you can see, we are at a point of I guess non-consensus on about 4 points. I don't know if you've had a chance to review some of the comments or the specific areas. I mean, do you find that we are close, as we heard this evening, or this afternoon, I guess not quite evening yet, but we can reach a consensus, or what I'm hearing you say is we should give it some more time. What do you have any thoughts about again on this question of I understand we have national standards, but at some point, I think, like New Jersey, Maryland, we want to make sure we're out front on this, and so, that's why we're here today.
Thanks for the question, and good to see you, Commissioner. Let me answer that with two answers that are in concert. The first is which, if you think there's consensus today on this, then certainly you can and should move along, but it sounds to me like there's still some work to be done, and I would suggest that, and this was our experience in New Jersey, that having the staff, having industry in the room, to deliberate over what was workable, what could be worked, and what was effective, was the most effective for ultimately for our when we finally issued our directive. So I would ask you to consider whether you think that that can be done, but if it can be, then it can and should be done through the working group to recommend it back to them for further consideration. The second is, and this goes to the point that you've heard a little bit about, that we did give in the directive flexibility to what became, which we knew it would, this iterative sense of the threat, that the standards might change, that the company's risk profiles might change. And to that extent, there is built into our directive the ability for the companies, for the industry, along with the board staff specifically, to continue to work actively as those threats evolve. And in fact, in New Jersey, under our directive, there is a cybersecurity specific working group that includes the industry representatives, senior board staff, and representatives of the state's Department of Homeland Security, including the director of our Fusion Center, the Information Sharing Center, who sit in on those monthly meetings to assess and to manage on an ongoing basis these very threats that you're looking to protect.
Okay. Well, thank you. And then, as you know from your time as chair of the NARUC Critical Infrastructure, the states are at this point at different levels throughout the country. So, again, I think we're like New Jersey trying to be a front runner on this, and then hopefully we can get this right. So, thank you.
Commissioner Barbe.
I'm good, thank you.
Commissioner Sussman. Well, actually, one question. Since you're with the national governors, there was a comment earlier about one of the concerns was that, we don't want 50 different ways of doing this. So is there any discussion going on amongst the governors to try to create some sort of like minimal baseline or best practices when it comes to this, so that the utilities, particularly the ones that are multi-state operations, aren't trying to deal with different regulations, different places?
Right. I can tell you that in the conversations this morning, there was a recognition that should be the case, that there should not be those kinds of requirements that are onerous or duplicative, but there should be some sort of baseline, some sort of foundational elements. And also a recognition, by the way, that the work that the NARUC baseline group did do was a really good start. However, I will admit that those are very basic standards, really in the hopes that those states that have not gone as far as your state, as New Jersey's gone, to take those and begin to initiate a cybersecurity regime. As I said, some states have not. But a recognition that it should not be duplicative or contrary to each other or onerous. And that conversation sort of ends at that point, and then the work begins in each state to establish what those internal state guidelines with their industry should be.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your participation, and have a safe trip home. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess why don't we turn to Potomac Edison First Energy, if there's anything you want to add that you haven't already added?
Mr. Chairman, they were just here for questions.
Oh, okay.
So we're all out of witnesses.
Alrighty. Now, I noticed we got some folks here from Do It.
Yes, sir.
And so if you want to make any comments, I'm perfectly willing to let you make some statements, and we probably got a couple of questions for you. So however you want to do it. So.
Yes, sir. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have I have some very short statements. And first of all, I want to say, thank you, Commissioner Suchman, Commissioner Richard, and Commissioner Barve for being here, giving us the time to talk, and also asking such insightful questions. So my name is Lance Cleghorn. I am the Director of State Cybersecurity. I brought with me today Chris Kroick, who is the State Director of Cyber Resilience. We're here today to answer any questions that the Commission may have on the Do It reporting guidelines specifically that were published last November. And I'd love to start by just making the Commission aware of some recent events that really help establish our basis for implementing the guidelines in the way that we chose to. So just a few days ago, on March the 18th, Governor Moore received a letter from the White House signed by the EPA and the National Security Council highlighting recent campaigns by foreign government actors to compromise water and wastewater critical infrastructure. The EPA and NSC then met with state representatives to underscore the importance of states working with utility providers to ensure that they are appropriately implementing cybersecurity best practices and elevating incidents. About 2 weeks after our guidelines were published back in November, adversaries associated with the Iranian government were discovered to have gained access to water and wastewater systems, disabling them with malicious intent. These actors targeted programmable logic controllers with default credentials exposed to the internet, which is nearly word for word one of the 4 examples given in the Do It guidelines. Early last month, in February, CISA published a joint cybersecurity advisory regarding the Chinese government's efforts to gain access to critical infrastructure networks for future operational activity. This was referred to as Volt Typhoon, which you heard mentioned earlier. Forgive me, I lost my place. These efforts targeted the IT systems of utilities and utilized phishing as a primary point of initial compromise, another example provided in the Do It Requirements Guideline for reporting successful activity. Now, the folks in the State Office of Security Management don't moonlight as psychics. These guidelines are not arbitrary. They are based on known adversary activity that we closely monitor at the state and federal level. Having utilities comply with the legislative requirements to report incidents as defined by the State Chief Information Security Officer is critically important in our ability to take action and defend the critical infrastructure of Maryland from adversaries that we know are actively and successfully attempting to exploit these systems. Thank you.
Okay, let me start off with a couple of questions. So there's been this question about the manual and its application. And while I understand that, there's a difference between, the manual being utilized by, the State Department of Widgets versus, us, we probably aren't the only state agency that has a relationship with outside entities. So how have you dealt with this situation with other agencies?
It's a good question. So in most cases, our scope is limited to either the state agencies themselves or in the case of local governments with the Senate and House bills that passed for reporting on local governments, those areas as well. So the way we handle that is the exact same way that we intend to handle the utility requirements with some slight exceptions. So we have our Maryland Security Operations Center, which functions 24/7, 365 to take in these kind of reports. We have our own Maryland-focused information sharing and accessibility center, so an ISAC. With those, we focus on looking at these incidents, trying to determine what their relevance is to the state of Maryland and the stakeholders, and then determining how we remediate them for state agencies, remediate them for local governments, and then with utilities being slightly nuanced, how do we take the value add from these reports and disseminate them to the rest of the Maryland critical infrastructure stakeholders that may be receiving reports from us.
Okay, so that brings up the question of sort of how do we fit in to that process? I mean, if you see something and think something ought to be done, do you tell us to tell them, or do you tell them and tell us at the same time?
It's unique, but the way we've decided to handle it when working with John and the PSC is that we would take the reports in initially from the Maryland SOC to reduce the impact of reporting from the utility providers, and we would pass the information directly to the PSC. In the event that there is critical energy infrastructure information, so CEII as defined by federal law, that information would go directly to the PSC. We do not, to the point that was made earlier about the state collecting information that it doesn't want, we have no clearances nor desire to possess CEII, and we would like to just limit that to the details of the incident.
Okay. So any other questions, Commissioner Suchman?
So you heard Mr. Aronson talk about the fact that depending on what you're asking, you could end up with millions of reports. So are you at all concerned about the level of reporting that could happen, and do you have staff to handle 1 million reports? I'm assuming that answer is no. But.
No, ma'am. And I think that kind of drives at the heart of where we're at with the difference, right? So we've talked a lot about how close we are to consensus. it's our interpretation that using the MITRE attack framework is one of the best ways because it establishes a common parlance for talking about these kind of incidents. We've heard, at length about how definitions can be difficult to interpret incidents against, that the landscape is constantly changing. And so one of the things that we feel like, is essential to this process is having a defined standard that fits all of these incidents in a flexible way. So within the state, we've settled on the MITRE attack framework. And then within our guidelines, we've attempted to publish on top of that examples for interpreting the MITRE attack framework if it's something that an agency, a utility provider doesn't work with already. And so if you're following the MITRE attack framework, the types of things that we're asking to be reported are absolutely not AUP violations. They're absolutely not unsuccessful phishing attempts. They are guaranteed successful attempts by foreign threat actors or, financially based local threat actors, and which is something that we see quite frequently at the state. So it's our opinion that if you interpret, MITRE attack framework in the way that the standard was designed, that we're not asking for these millions of reports. In fact, we're asking for things that are very targeted and malicious.
Okay, so you heard the testimony from Mr. Quinn and Mr. Aronson.
Yes.
So how would you respond to their concerns that the requirements now in the draft regulations are overbroad?
It's a fine question. I think we don't feel that they are overbroad, and we feel like if interpreted correctly, with the examples given, that these are not in fact overbroad. I don't exactly understand where the difference is in that, and I think to the point, I think that's where our differences lie at this point. Is what is really the definition of an incident as we're going after it, and we use the MITRE attack framework, and the specific categories that we've asked to be reported on are indicators of successful activities by an adversary.
Okay, so you are not interested in the example of the doorknob.
No. Ma'am.
Okay, so because it sounds like you may be closer than, and so maybe going back to the work group, sort of recognizing that it's the successful incursion that you're interested in. Maybe that you can kind of okay. And then in terms of so you receive the reports. You turn them over to us. Certainly the CEII you can't handle.
Yes, ma'am.
Is your plan to do something with the report also, other than turn it over to us? So what is it that you will be doing with the information that you're going to be receiving?
Yes, ma'am. So our functions are primarily on incident investigation, indicating, indicators of compromise, indicators of malicious activity, and then turning that information into actionable intelligence that the state can utilize, that local governments can utilize, that other members of the utility community can take advantage of to prevent future attacks. So, i.e., if Edison Electric or whoever is being actively compromised, they make a report. We do investigations and determine, to the point of Vault Typhoon, these specific indicators of compromise are indicative of the threat actor. We can then share that among the state and take preventative measures to ensure that this actor doesn't move into other sectors within the state or into state agencies and local agencies that serve these same functions.
Okay, so preventative measures are they going to also include working with the utility to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yes, I mean, I can't say directly that that's DeWitt's responsibility as a primary responsibility to the state executive agencies. It's not something that we would allocate resources to necessarily, but we do have an information sharing and analysis center and ISAC that the utilities are more than welcome to, subscribe to. As noted, there's many ISACs at this point. There's ones focused on electric, water, so the value of that may or may not be relevant to the utility providers, but they're more than welcome to take advantage of that information.
But your mission is to take the information that you're getting from the utility, be able to determine what happened, and then be able to share that with other Maryland state agencies.
And local governments and, relevant utility partners within state and local, so i.e. we would share with the PSC.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Barbe. Commissioner Richard.
Just thank you for thank you for being here today. I appreciate your testimony. So I mean, at this point, I guess a lot of the good questions were asked, but I did want to find out: do you still have confidence in the work group process here? Do you believe that we are arriving at some consensus on I think there were 4 issues?
So I can speak specifically to the definition issue and the reporting issue, the zero trust issue, and I think there's a fourth one that I don't think is within the scope of the state CISO and do it to have an opinion on.
Okay.
But in so much as those two incidents, so we went through an iterative process. We attended the working group. We received, I think, 2 full rounds of feedback from the utility. We made multiple concessions in the initial draft to the draft that's been published. You know, Mr. Commissioner, I don't know that if we go back to a working group that the state's position from do it is going to shift very dramatically, but you know, it's certainly within our purview to go and have the conversation again. But I will say, I think our position at this point is pretty firm after going through the rounds of iterative feedback.
Okay. But you do think it's okay if we maybe do one more round and just to see where we end up? Is that
You know, we've made the commitment to be, you know, a partner in an iterative process, which I think has been said multiple times, and, you know, we agree on that. And these things do change. And so we recognize that, you know, what's published today and you know, what we published in 2023 may not be relevant by the end of 2024. So we have a commitment to continue to iterate this process, you know, as it stands right now. Don't know that on those 2 specific issues that we intend to shift very far at all.
okay? But are we on, I guess, the timeline the state would like to be on at this point, or where would you rate the Public Service Commission as far as?
It's a fantastic question, and I think it's, you know, you asked a question earlier that Mr. Quinn answered, and I want to apologize for how this, you know, ended up coming across as like do it is enforcing this requirement. So in the state legislature, it requires the state CISO to publish guidelines. So when we say that it's in effect or enforced, from our perspective, those guidelines are published. DO-IT has met its obligation under the law to define those standards. We took the feedback, we did the iteration, and we published that. So that is our take on that. So if that answers the question.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. And then finally, there's been talk about you know, harmonization. I believe that means across the states, but also, you know, we hear this patchwork, and I guess my concern is there may be a lot of places where there aren't patches, they're just holes, and that Maryland, you know, I think we're trying to be among the leading states in this area. Do you have an opportunity to work with some of the other leading states to at least can we contribute to the harmonization, or how is that working?
Yes, sir. It takes place at multiple levels. So from a cybersecurity focus, we regularly collaborate with other states. You know, just last week we were at a state-focused conference speaking with other state leaders and state CISOs on these same subjects. And critical infrastructure is not, you know, low on that list of priorities. So it is something that we regularly work on from a cybersecurity perspective. But there is also coordination between, you know, agencies tasked with environmental protection, wastewater protection, these specific areas of critical infrastructure that do also coordinate across the states and with federal partners as well.
Okay, good. So you feel like at this point Maryland is contributing to try to come up with some harmonization, at least among the leading states?
Absolutely, and I think not only are we contributing, I think oftentimes we show up as one of the first people to the party.
Perfect, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to Commission Advisor John Burkowski, and the ball's in your court.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Hoover and Commissioners. I guess I want to clarify just one thing. Repeatedly, this petition for rulemaking has been referred to as a staff petition, and I want to correct the record on that. This is not a staff petition. It's a petition from the Cybersecurity Reporting Work Group, and it's a non-consensus petition, but I don't work for staff anymore, and the Office of Cybersecurity is not in staff. Our role in leading the Cybersecurity Reporting Work Group is to implement the Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity Act to be true to the legislative intent. You know, while in my role as the leader of the Cybersecurity Reporting Work Group, I collaborated with the public service companies to try to make these regulations, particularly in Chapter 1, there's 2 chapters in the regs, but particularly in Chapter 1, I tried to make them as workable as possible, but I felt like I had to yield to both DO-IT and the Maryland Cybersecurity Council on certain interpretations. And that's based on reading the statute language and the fact that the Maryland Cybersecurity Council helped Senator Hester write the bill and is aware more of the legislative intent than I am. I will take responsibility for the regulations in Chapter 2 totally, because that is the compliance regulations, the compliance and enforcement regulations, and those are largely driven by us because we have to basically go out and enforce the regulations. You know, when I met with the Maryland Cybersecurity Council last September, they exhorted me not to just check the boxes with these regulations. Indeed, just the fact that the Office of Cybersecurity now exists at all, and the fact that we have 3 people staffing the Office of Cybersecurity, you know, we received additional positions given our state's competing staffing needs. That in itself is a testament to the fact that the legislative intent is not to just check the boxes. You know, and what I mean by checking the boxes is, you know, having regulations but not enforcing their compliance. So I'm not going to speak a lot about some of the issues that have already been hashed through, because really I think that's subject to interpretation of the legislative intent, and I've done as much as I can to try to get to a point where we at least could bring these regulations to you for a discussion, because we're really at an impasse.
Sure.
I think that my main area of influence really is with the Chapter 2, with the enforcement parts of the regulations. In those regulations, we petitioned the Commission to delegate compliance and enforcement authority for the regs to the Office of Cybersecurity, and this authority requested is very similar to what has already been delegated to the Commission's Gas Division for the enforcement of pipeline safety regulations that are in COMAR 20.57. The rationale for this delegation request is to efficiently handle compliance and enforcement, because I anticipate that these regulations will require many enforcement interventions, especially initially because we have many small public service companies that have chosen not to get involved in the development of these regulations. I've compiled a list of over 50 public service companies that are subject to these regulations, and although we've invited these companies to participate in the cybersecurity working group, we've only had about a dozen active public service companies in the work group. Therefore, I predict that you know, we're going to have to take dozens of compliance actions, at least initially, because many of these companies are not paying attention to what we're doing here. And once we do not receive the reports, we're going to have to follow up with these companies and enforce the regulations. And I do have experience with enforcing regulations, because I was in the Commission's Engineering Division, where we processed about 100 notices of probable violations a year. And I can tell you it's a very labor-intensive process, and without similar regulations delegating enforcement authority to now what exists with the 20.57 regs for the Gas Division, I feel like we may get bogged down. And the other reason for the proposed compliance and enforcement regs is the confidentiality concerns that are expressed by the Public Service Commission. We do agree with the public service companies with their confidentiality concerns, and a lot of the work that we've done in the last couple of months, we've been spending some considerable effort to ensure that we have processes for securing encrypted document creation, email communications, and also an encrypted file storage system. I do think that cybersecurity compliance and enforcement carries some risk should public company or service company compliance gaps become public, and we don't want this information to be misused. And a similar paradigm exists with the NERC-CIP enforcement, which is non-public, and confidential, And although there are reports released, it's aggregate enforcement data that's anonymized. So I do think there's a precursor even at the federal level for what we need to do with enforcement for cybersecurity regs. And finally, we've said that we've seen that this petition does not have full consensus. And I do want to let you know that I have set up a meeting of the cybersecurity work group for tomorrow to consider any direction that we may or may not receive today. And the one concern that I have, and I think it was stated earlier, maybe by Mr. Quinn, about this July 1st deadline for the cybersecurity assessments. That is sort of the burning platform as far as a timeline. I really feel like we need to have something, some agreement there that, in order to enable utilities to give us their assessments by July 1st, 2024. So with all else notwithstanding, if the commission agrees with at least what's in Chapter 1, Regulation 7 for periodic assessments, then even if it takes longer to arrive at other regulations, I would want to maybe issue an order or recommend the commission issue an order just so we can give direction to the utilities regarding that particular aspect of the regulation. And with that, I'll
Okay.
turn it over to you for questions.
So, regarding the companies that haven't responded without being explicit, I mean, can you give me a sense of, who they are and my assumption is that that some of the smaller ones that have pretty small scale operations, period. So.
We've only had one municipal utility participate. We've only had one water utility participate. We've had all the large IOUs, of course, and cooperatives participate, but not some of the smaller co-ops, and so that's basically where we're at. Just the large gas and electric investor-owned utilities, larger co-ops, and one water company and one.
So I guess one question is, I mean, obviously you can do your own, outreach and try and do that, but is there a way to sort of up the ante and maybe, get their attention by anything that we can do to sort of encourage them to participate in this process?
Well, I think an order related to at least the assessments, they should be looking at that. I've sent emails to our contact list. I pulled engineering's contact list because we inspect all these companies.
Sure.
But they're not the cyber people, and I've asked in the email that they turn this over to their cyber people.
Okay.
But I've gotten very little response from some of these smaller companies.
Okay. All right. I guess regarding the regulations, I mean, do you want to just kind of start working through, or do you want to pull it? Just 1 sec. Or do you want to do the ones that really are consensus that there's no opposition, so that we can kind of clear them off the deck? Or, I mean, how do you want to proceed on this?
Okay. Well, Catherine will have the regs. She already has the regs up, and I will quickly go through and just highlight areas I think we need to focus on.
Okay.
So if you look at the general, Chapter 1,
And
general.
let me, before you get going, so anybody who has like a burning issue related to anything that he brings up, let me know and we'll take a spot. But I don't necessarily want to do wordsmithing at this point, so. Oh, and actually, you did want to, so.
Yeah, if I may, because I didn't have the benefit of
Yeah.
hearing the discussion when I made my comments. A couple broad comments. One, I think there is consensus. One of the issues of the legislation was to have these assessments done. I think there's support for that. Another one was on staffing. I think that's been done. The third one is we want to make sure it wasn't just on electric utilities, bulk power. It was the distribution in the electrical area, in water and gas. So as you think about it, it's across the board.
Sure.
And in fact, we had an NSA fellow last year on electrical. This year, the NSA fellow is focused on water.
Well, but one thing along the lines of water, I mean, we have some jurisdiction over water companies, but there are two big water entities that we really don't have any jurisdiction over, one being the city of Baltimore and the second one being WSSC. So to the extent that we develop regulations applicable to the water industry, it's a relatively small subset of the water providers in the state.
And we plan on talking directly to them
Okay,
with
that's good.
ideas. And then just a couple of things on reporting. We also want some focus on significant insights and signals. We don't want it too broad, and we don't want it so too narrow or superficial. And then as far as harmonization, which has benefits, it tends to be a laggard. You know, it takes a while for harmonization to happen. It tends to be the lowest common denominator in delay. And so I think the forward-leaning states, you heard from New Jersey and from Maryland in reliability and in cyber is appropriate. So I think you have the jurisdiction. I think you can lean forward, and that might help NERC as they're doing the update to their SIP standard to tie in some of the ideas that we have, which are useful. So I encourage you to lean forward in terms of doing that, and you have the ability to do that.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Thanks. Go ahead, John.
Okay, so what I propose to do is we'll quickly go through each section and I'll highlight the issues, and if there's a major issue for deliberation, we can get into it. Within the first chapter, 01 general under scope, I do not think that we really have an issue with the Public Service Commission's authority to regulate cybersecurity. We're not attempting to overlap with NERC or even TSA, and when we get into the assessments, I would propose later that we include TSA along with NERC and use them as acceptable attestations. When it gets down to the do it manual, here, I do want to recognize that the plain language in the statute that gives do it CISO some authority over how incidents are reported, but I do agree that the scope needs to be narrowed to some extent. So I really do feel like this is one where you can see that we have non-consensus, and it doesn't seem like we have any middle ground here. So I feel like we need some direction from the commission on this particular aspect, because the utilities want to have the definition modified. We've seen comments from Senator Hester and also the Maryland Cybersecurity Council, which want the definition a little bit narrowed, and the interpretation of the existing manual is broad. So I feel like we need some direction here.
Let me just understand so go up a little bit to the reference to do it. So is it? I'm trying to understand how it's used in the regulations. Is do it? So do it is not just guidance. Do it is a directive. Is that?
Yeah, it's, well, in the scope, we list the documents that are incorporated by reference into the regulation. And the Do It manual is referenced here because of the fact that, that's part of the incident reporting requirements that are later in the regulation. We'd have to skip ahead to the appropriate section.
Well, So the problem with incorporating anything by reference is that you're incorporating by reference a document at a given point in time. So to the extent that the document ever changes, you'd actually have to change the regulations, or you're stuck with the earlier document. So there's kind of a rigidity there that doesn't allow for any sort of changes. I mean, I'm just wondering if and I understand, your concern in wanting to get to get industry to be focused to specific issues, but recognizing again with the discussion today that cyber is a sort of an iterative, for lack of a better term, process. Would you be comfortable with this document sort of referencing do it manual as guidance rather than directive? Because and I would take out the date, because then it would be guidance for a particular date as opposed to the guidance that and where you have guidance as opposed to directive, it gives you more flexibility in terms of because you may be making changes to the manual I mean, I can tell you, having worked for many years on NERC changed completely the way that they set standards. They were much more directive in the beginning, and then it became outcome based. So, and that was a sea change in how they looked at reliability and reliability compliance. I'm just telling you from my own personal experience working in lots of different issues. I mean, when you're so specific on something, and that something is also external to the regulations, you create a problem for yourself in terms of making any changes, as opposed to referencing the manual and having it serve as guidance. And that may help you to get over the issue of. So I'm just sort of offering that as.
Yes, ma'am. I have two comments on that, if I may.
Please.
So firstly, our document, we've heard it referred to as a manual. It is titled as a guideline, and we do intend to update it on at least a yearly basis, as we do with all cybersecurity policies. They're reviewed and updated regularly. So I think it's very astute to assume that if we put it into guidelines as such, this version, that we will be updating it. The second is that, from DeWitt and the CISO's perspective, these guidelines will be, at his discretion to update and release. And that's what we feel like we've done at this point, is we've published the first draft of these guidelines that is now in effect from our perspective.
So let me go to OPC and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Suchman. I think we agree with you generally. I think the rub lies in, if you look at the statutory language in Public Utility Article 5306 D2, it specifically says that the state Chief Information Security Officer, in consultation with the Commission, shall establish a process for reporting cybersecurity incidents, including establishing what criteria, what is an incident, essentially. So I think there's sort of a rub of the law itself actually dictates that the CISO determines what is an incident. So I think that's sort of what we've been kind of dancing around, the sort of definition, and it's sort of I won't get into like that. I don't like the legislative, does this CISO now, have regulatory authority over the utilities or not? I'm not going to get into that, but I think there's sort of an issue there.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to speak to that too. Thank you. The language clearly says the state CISO has to consult with the commission. Okay, and that's what's going on now. The state CISO cannot just issue a directive. They would have to go through a APA promulgation process, or the commission will. So what we're doing here today, it's the commission that is promulgating regulations, and you can decide what to put in those regulations and what not to. The statute says the CISOs to consult with the commission on cybersecurity incident reporting, and that's what's going on right now. It's disappointing to hear DeWitt say, we're not going to change our position. This is what we want. But all due respect to them, I respect them, but it's your responsibility as the agency with jurisdiction over public utilities to promulgate regulations in this space. I think the statute contemplates that. It may not have said it explicitly to tell the commission to go promulgate regs, but that's why we cited to the Delmarva case. Agencies have to act through when they're passing directives of future import and on widespread application, like what this will be. It needs to be adopted through the regulatory process. So just to clarify, so you have the authority to change or not the Do-It manual. So I'm still not clear if Do-It's position is the manual is applicable to us today. I don't think it is. I think I heard them say it isn't. But that's what we're here. That was point one, Commissioner Richard, in our 4 points. But if we can get past that, and I think we really only have 2 left, the cybersecurity incident reporting and this zero trust sort of enforcement, because I think we've agreed on the assessment. So we're down to 2, if we can just get past this, if that helps any. Thank you.
So I'm wondering do you have to reference the manual? So I'm actually wondering if you can put in language about what it is you would like without, I think the manual may be causing a problem. And I'm not sure it's going to help you anyway. Every time you change it, then it creates sort of a new challenge. I'm always one to try to not put, language and regulation that is going to require that you make changes to the regulation next year.
Yep.
So, and because of, as you pointed out, cyber is constantly changing, you want to have regulations that can work with the changes. So I'm wondering if there's a way to maybe put in what you'd like, but not refer to the manual, because I think maybe the manual's the thing that's.
Commissioner Stutzman, thank you. I'll just say that I don't think we have a preference other than that, we want to make clear that from Do-It's perspective, we've met the legislative intent of collaborating, receiving feedback from the utility providers. We've gone through several rounds of feedback. It's not that, we've taken this position and never moved. We've given concessions in almost every aspect of the document. And so we're at the point now where we've reached, our conclusion with the state CISO of where we're comfortable in being able to
So
achieve.
I wonder if you can put in words what you'd like the language in the regulations to say about reporting.
It's a fair question. I think our directive from the legislature was to establish, the definition and reporting guidelines, which is, again, what I think we feel like Do-It has accomplished when we released this guideline document. And as to applicability, again, we're not a regulatory agency, as I think has been pointed out, so I have no authority to make this a regulatory requirement, but we've published it and met our objective under the legislature as we interpret it.
If I could make a suggestion, what if it said something like the most recent version of this manual?
Well, actually,
It already says that.
Well,
I mean,
I-
and this is standard language. I mean, in 20.060101C, it says, unless otherwise specified by the commission, a public service company shall use the applicable provisions in the latest revised version of the incorporated by reference publications listed below. That is standard regulatory language. So, by regulation, every time Do-It would update their manual, it would be in effect because of that standard, and it's not just used here, it's used in other places, that standard regulatory language.
so one question I have though is, obviously, we get Do-It's manual. Does that mean you're going to be supplying it to them, or how's that work?
Yes, sir. It's published on our website and freely available.
Yeah.
So they'd have to go get it. You wouldn't necessarily. When you revise your manual, you don't send out a new manual to all the people that it applies to. You just sort of say, hey, here it is, and entity that's subject to it needs to go find it.
Yeah, Chairman Hoover, that's correct. We don't maintain any kind of contact list for the people that would fall under this. So we would have no way of notifying them of changes other than to make it public on our website. No, again, to point, we would work with the Public Service Commission to hopefully achieve that.
Yeah.
Put a link on our.
Yeah. So,
Oh, I was just
Oh.
going to suggest we put a link on our website.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So,
So,
actually, one question I got, and I don't want to put Mr. Dean on the spot, I mean, but has staff, have we run into this situation before, and how have we dealt with it in other entities? And Mr. Burkowski, have you got experience from your previous positions here, chime in too, so.
Oh, Your Honor, the state puts out an incorporation by reference manual on how to write regulations. To do that, it's fairly extensive, and I think if you follow that, that's probably the best way to comply. And if you don't follow it, down in Annapolis, they'll point that out for us.
Sure, I understand. Okay, sir.
Yeah, I'll take you up on your offer to have me at least give an opinion here.
Sure.
In the work group, I knew that I couldn't bridge this divide, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get in front of you. But I feel like, and this was bashed a little bit by the joint utilities too, but I feel like it's clear from the legislative intent, from what we've heard from both the Maryland Cybersecurity Council and the Office of Senator Hester, that the existing cybersecurity breach reporting requirement is not sufficient. We need to have material events that are basically, and I forget the words, and Cyril, you might remember, and sort of something that, causes you to have concerns. And I can't remember the exact words, but, when we've had these periodic utility briefings, we learned that some utilities actually log things that they call events of interest. And I know that's not very well defined. I'm not defending that, but an event of interest is something that utilities themselves investigate. And so they get actual hacks that have impacts, and they know they have to report them. But I think the types of things that we want to know about, in addition to material events that are actual intrusions, are these things that the utilities feel the need to investigate themselves because of the materiality of the event. So I was trying to promote in the work group a concept of event of interest. It didn't really take hold. It's not in our regs. It's in a description in the work group report, but it's not in the regs. But the concept there is, if I couldn't bridge the DOIT and the utility perspectives on this, I have enforcement. I have the Office of Cybersecurity, and I have enforcement, and I would only enforce items that were events of interest, meaning I would somehow every year, or actually it would be every 2 years, when we bring in the utilities to talk about their assessments, because they're only supplying attestations, we'd be meeting with them separately to talk about their assessments. We would have an inspection checklist, and one of the questions in there would be about, events of interest. And, we would expect those to be reported, and that's something that really, could be used. And I use the example of, it's like you have a law that says you drive at 55, but the police don't enforce it until you exceed 67. So the fact that you have a do-it manual that says you need to do certain things, I would not enforce it unless they,
Well, so, Mr. Prokowski, I wonder if there's, I'm a little concerned about the getting, millions of reports in. So I'm wondering if there is a way to maybe define what incidents need to be reported that's less than I mean, because there may be utilities that should actually be keeping track of this stuff that don't. And so you want to catch those too. So I wonder if there's certainly the incidents that resulted in effective,
Well, actually, can I suggest something here? Obviously, Mr. Burkowski, you're saying that these utilities have a list of instances, but they don't look into all of them. I think certainly the ones that they take action into and the ones that they investigate, those certainly ought to bubble to the top of the list, I would
yeah,
think.
but I'm worried about the utilities that don't do that and that should do that. So I'm sort of wondering if there's a way to define the scope to be broader than perhaps Mr. Quinn where you're going, but still doesn't get to the level that Mr. Aronson has identified. So that because it may just be that you may also be interested in knowing about failed incidences, because it may sort of demonstrate a pattern, not just with utilities, but maybe with other agencies as well, that wouldn't get reported to you if we didn't broaden the scope to include those.
Actually, so
Mr.
go
Chairman,
ahead and-
thank you so much. Commissioner Suchman, that's to your point. We've offered additional definitions of cybersecurity incident during the work group that were rejected. So to your point, I think it's important to put that in the COMAR reg. I think it's important for you to put it in the COMAR reg. When you leave it to the do it manual and the do it manual is updated next year, are the utilities going to be consulted on that? It sounded like the do it CISO is going to update the manual as he sees fit. That's going to be an issue. And so this is the type of discussion that needs to happen at the work, but a serious consultation, not just we're going to do it through the do it manual and that's it. So we're hoping, I appreciate the discussion today, and to talk about Jason can, if with your indulgence, can talk about the types of incident definitions we offered during the work group that were rejected, and this discussion of events of interest. We may be on the right track there, but that's not what the do it manual says,
So-
and that's the problem.
Yeah. So before you start, I mean, is there a reason why they weren't rejected, or weren't accepted, I guess?
Well, again, because of the statute language, I defer to do it. I mean, it clearly states in the statute.
And your view was that it wasn't compliant with what you were required to do under the statute.
Yes, sir. And we received all of this feedback. We considered it. Again, we made concessions in almost every area of the document.
No,
from
I
the
understand that part, but so I just want to get, so why don't you tell me what you offered, and I guess we'll consider it, so. Yeah, you go ahead.
All right, thank you, Commissioner, or Chairman. Yeah, so I think we provided several rounds of commentary back to do it that from our perspective didn't really move the needle at all, and it really centers around our concerns with this signal to noise ratio. Can we find good fidelity? We had asked that the regulation as a definition, we had proposed a broader definition than what exists in COMAR today, to include attempted incidents and things in that vein. I don't have the text right in front of me of precisely what we had proposed, because I wanted to, our concern, talking about what we think is a good faith reading of the manual, for example, for our company alone. When Mr. Borkowski's talking about events of events of interest, right? That's something we track. We're one of the companies that track that. But based on how that is discussed and being used in compliance, I think off the top of my head that would result in us making about 77 reports per day to do it. Based on the description of what you find in their manual or their guideline, combined with what Mr. Borkowski's talking about in terms of an event of incident, we track all those statistics. We're going to report 77 items per day, almost all of which, in our view, have no meaningful value to anybody, because as it's written, these regulations use very, very broad terms. They talk about impact, potential of things. There's a whole section on exfiltration of data that doesn't contemplate the fact that the data didn't come from us. There's a lot of very, very broad language that's used here that is not in the norm of reporting. It's much, much more in that vein of information sharing. And to comply, our concern is we're going to just overwhelm the system in a good faith effort to interpret and apply this legislation, and we don't think that's what anybody really wants.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So of these 77 incidences that you make note of every day, how many do you act upon? Take some sort of action other than saying, oh, yeah, that's just that.
I think, Commissioner, it's a broad spectrum. It could be simple. We use a lot of automation for things. Some of it is almost a manual check on that automation. Yep, that's exactly what should have happened. Deal with that. It could be anything. We force someone to make a password change, or this is something that we got to look at a little longer. An analyst spends a couple hours on it. You know what, this really wasn't anything but this indicator fired. We had to take a look at it. Most of these events of interest are of interest to us in terms of performing the security operations function. But when researched and looked at, they don't represent any sort of real meaningful threat to our systems, especially to an energy delivery system or customer information. They're all very benign. So, that's why we were trying to request that do it and the regulation really hone this down into the items that really matter. Because
Well, let me ask the question differently then. Obviously, in your internal management structure, you make decisions about these things, and most of them are pretty turn-the-crank operations. You have protocols for dealing with this kind of a problem or that kind of a problem, but occasionally serious issues rise up.
Mhm.
And so how do you internally describe that to yourselves? What label do you put on it?
Yeah.
The reason I'm asking is because it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that in this issue area, you're not really competitors with the people you compete against financially. Really, you all have a shared incentive to inform everybody about a particular kind of threat, because I don't think if utility ABC is coming under a threat, I don't think it's, maybe you would see it as neutral if a competing utility down the road came under but I don't think so. I think the instinct in your company's culture would be to see that a threat against you would be, or a threat against your competitor is in some way a threat against yourself as well. And so I suppose what I'm trying to search here for is, I know that your management identifies the serious threats in some fashion, and it seems to me you have an incentive to put a flag on that for all of the players in the state of Maryland. Am I right or wrong about that?
No, Commissioner, you're right about that, and I think you've hit on two really important aspects to that. The first thing I'll say is in terms of the prioritization to management. And I can only speak for First Energy, right? Because ours is going to be slightly different than everyone else's, but in a consistent fashion. We actually classify something in terms of 5 levels of severity. The vast majority of these events of interest that were discussed, we would classify as severity 0, which for us is a non-impacting something we took a look at. Beyond that, we have 4 levels of severity that are defined in terms of, it gets a little fuzzy, but it's in terms of how many users were impacted or how many end user laptops were impacted versus did this impact servers or a public facing website. And then up to severity 4, which is a a catastrophic type of attack that's affected reliability of the grid. That's how we classify those internally. But the other thing too, I think what you just mentioned is we don't, and as a cyber practitioner, we don't view our cyber colleagues and other companies as competitors at all.
Yeah.
And this was discussed earlier in terms of, for example, the electric information sharing, EISAC. We share lots of information. We are part of different organizations, both government and private, where we're happy to share that type of indicator information. Hey, we saw these things. But the bright distinction for us, though, is there's voluntary information sharing to help everybody versus regulatory mandated incident reporting, where the implication is, Commissioner, I think you used the term, someone made a mistake or failed. I forget what your term was, where there's an issue that has to be reported because it's material. It brings threat and risk to operations, to customer data, to reliability. To us as utilities, those are very, very different.
I kind of feel that there has to be a way to craft language to capture the fact that if I'm a competitor and I'm the utility in Baltimore and he's a utility in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I experience a threat that I believe is I experience an attack that is serious to me and which I think he would consider to be serious if it happened to him. There's got to be some sort of a language which would, of course, involve relying upon the judgment of management to define what a serious threat is. I think that's the way we should go for two reasons. Number one, we can't do 77 reports a day. That would clearly not be. That would clearly be counterproductive. But I think it's a useful exercise to put all the managements in the state into the mental, exercise of making a decision about what is and is not serious. And now, of course, I'm not an attorney and I've never crafted regulations, but it seems to me that's the way we should be going about it. Maybe I'm incorrect, and I'd love to hear what anybody would think.
I'm actually wondering, listening to Commissioner Barvey, which sometimes is a mistake, but I think this one was the right one. Each sort of party here sort of has different agendas and different needs, and so the fact that the utility might have looked through 77 incidents and identified them as a zero, you've done the analysis, but it may be that DoIT actually needs that information for different reasons, and I'm wondering if it's just not possible to identify the specific information in regulation. And I know I'm just like throwing a little stink bomb in, but I wonder if there's another way in which outside of regulation, sort of a process can be developed for identifying the kinds of information that needs to be gathered that can evolve. I mean, so maybe the first month DoIT's getting too much information and they want to slow it down, or maybe they're not getting enough, and working with the parties to sort of identify what information it is that they need. It's possible that we can't put that into regulation, but we can put it into practice.
Commissioner Sushman, I'm sorry. I wanted to jump in there
Please.
because you've hit on what's going on here. There's a distinction between information sharing and incident reporting. Information sharing in these regs under the penalty under the possibility of enforcement and civil penalty is not the way you implement info sharing in the industry. They're voluntary agreement. We can do all that. You don't need these regs to do it. I shouldn't say do it, to accomplish that. You don't need these, information sharing can happen through voluntary agreements today, and it does. So that's Commissioner Barvey, you're right down the right spot. It's if there's information that needs to be shared, that can be done in a voluntary process. There's other avenues for
And it may
that
be that there is information
without threat of
that
penalty.
you need, that Do It needs, that they're not even aware of now. That all of a sudden, there's like a sort of a new category of information that, and if you're too specific in regulation, you won't get it until you come before us and we make changes to the regulation. I'm just wondering if you guys are sort of spinning around in circles unnecessarily, and that maybe, being more general in the regulation, and then having a work group. I know I hate to throw out another word, but having a group that actually identifies what the specific information you need, and that has this ability to evolve as needs come up.
That's the Fusion Center in New Jersey, Commissioner Suchman, that you heard Chairman Mraz talk about. There's a Fusion Center in New Jersey that just does information sharing. And the utilities participate in that, banks, there are avenues to do that, just not this way through this regulation.
Yeah, I think Mr. Aronson wants to get in on this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
But
let's have Do It respond first.
Yeah,
and I'll come
go
back.
ahead. Like-
So it's Cleghorn. I don't know if somehow that came across, but it's totally fine.
sorry about
Totally fine. So the point that I'd just like to make is that the MITRE attack framework is exactly our solution to this. Everyone is correct in saying if you started reporting 77 incidents to us tomorrow, we would be overwhelmed. We would not be able to handle that. But in the MITRE attack framework, we outline categories of compromise that are lateral movement. So an adversary is within your network and moving laterally between IT segments to OT segments. We're talking about command and control, which means an adversary has beachheads within your network. If these are being considered by the utility companies as priority 0 incidents, then we absolutely want to know that. I don't think that's the case. I think it's a misinterpretation or a misapplication of the MITRE attack framework, but that's what that kind of framework is aimed at doing. So again, Do It's perspective is if you apply the MITRE attack framework, the information we would be receiving would be verifiable malicious activity that is successful. It's not AUP violations. It's not failed phishing attempts. So I don't know how we bridge this gap on a technical level, but that's what we're aiming to do.
The Do It manual examples talk about failed phishing attempts.
Yeah, and I
It's
think
attached to your manual.
absolutely, and if I can speak to that, so that's not a failed phishing attempt, right? So we're talking about an email is received, an individual puts in their credentials, surrenders that. So we've been belabored with this example of a burglar coming to the door. Instead, it's a salesman. You let them in and you give them your credit card. They walk out the door with it, and then later you're like, oh, really should go and cancel that credit card. We want to know about that because that's successful malicious activity. If you don't put in the credentials, don't report it to us. Like that is truly failed phishing. What we've described is successful phishing.
All right. So
So
I guess either one.
Well, I'll react really quickly, but I'd rather hear from a practitioner on the application of MITRE attack as a framework for this. I love a good tortured metaphor, and so so right, bringing the salesman in. I still don't know that rises to the level of something that ought to be reportable. And the phrase that's in my mind is, on some level, this feels like a solution in search of a problem. I am really concerned. The questioner was asked earlier, like, what's concerning about this? Something as rigid as a annually updated document that may or may not have a whole lot of input from the owners and operators. This number 77 per entity, and I don't know how many entities the commission regulates, but I feel like that number gets really big really quickly. And even if we whittle this down to truly meaningful incidents, I don't want to use the word material, but truly meaningful incidents, I still think that number is bigger than you need it to be. And the point that President Moroz and that others have made is the value of information sharing, both among electric companies and Commissioner Barbe, there is no competition on security. This is something that we absolutely all work collaboratively on, to the point of even sharing people and material and equipment through things like cyber mutual assistance, where we share both knowledge and expertise in the middle of incidents. It sort of shows that camaraderie, and across sectors and with government partners, because to Mr. Cleghorn's point, you need to secure the state systems as well. We want to be supportive of that. And so I think a non-mandatory voluntary construct where, like a fusion center, and there's a bunch of different fusion centers all across the country, where industry, private sector of all stripes. We've talked a lot about the large companies who've participated in this proceeding and this rulemaking, but all the smaller entities benefit from this too. Jamming everybody together in some sort of a voluntary way where that signal can be pulled from the noise to everybody's benefit is, I think, the goal that we've all got here.
We can't do voluntary because the statute won't allow us. So the question is, how can we find a way to get Mr. Horn concerns addressed, but to try to find a way in regulation, I think it doesn't sound doable, but it's also not workable long term. I mean, is there, for example, a way, be more general than the legislation with a directive that you have to sit down with our cyber office and do it and figure out the information that they need, start collecting it, do what will figure out that's not enough, we want more, and if the parties are having an issue, then they come back to us and say, we've been trying to collect this information, we need more, and then we can issue an order directing more. But I'm not sure you're going to be able to craft something in regulation that's going to get everybody what they need now and 6 months from now and a year from now, because it's just going to keep changing. And it's going to need different information, and you don't want to come back to us and change the regulation.
Mandate voluntary sharing.
So a couple thoughts here. I mean, I understand the problem and the concern on the part of the utilities about anything that's in regulations that they're required to report, because if they don't, that's how they get, in the sling, so to speak, and wind up, in trouble with us. On the other hand, I understand DeWitt's concern that if an event happens, the question's going to be, why did this happen, and who's at fault, and things like that, and if they don't have, the relevant information to answer that question, either they or I, are going to be in the sling trying to figure this out. So, but the difficulty is, we all know what it is we want reported, but it's trying to translate that into words that we can stick into these regulations that will, not be overly burdensome when it comes to the people that have to do the reporting, but still provide all the relevant information for the people who want to see it. And
well, what if we crafted the language in this way to say that, and perhaps industry won't like this, but let me just say it this way, that the senior management of the utilities have an affirmative action to report what they regard as credible cyber attacks. Now, obviously, that's very fuzzy, and I would hate to be hit with a $1 million fine because of a fuzzy thing like that. But I think what I want to do, and I think what the legislation wants to do, is in some way formalize the notion that the one attack you get every month that's truly horrible is immediately relayed to someone, I'm not sure who, but to someone. I mean, I know the law requires that there be a mechanism of that kind. I just don't. I think that the best judgment of management is a thing that you engage in daily. So.
Well, the other thing, though, I'm concerned about is whenever we've done these rulemakings, I've been concerned about sort of writing stuff on the fly, so to speak.
Yes.
And so, I guess I'd want to maybe put this one aside and get some input from the utility side about what they think, meets the requirement, maybe have you comment on that, and then, along with, staff and OPC and the commission advisors, and then, maybe come up with something that way, so, as opposed to, because we're gonna spend all day just kind of chasing around this tree about trying to figure out what it is we want to be have in the regulation, so.
Well, can I speak to?
Sure.
I think that's where we've been, though. That's the problem.
Well, I understand, but I guess what I'm saying is if we get something in writing that the five of us can sort of look at and say, hey, this is what we think we ought to do, because we're sort of doing this, kind of sketching it on the screen or something like that, which I don't really want to do. So I really want to see the written ideas from the two sides or three sides, however many sides there are in this, and then we'll look at that and we'll figure out what it is that we think meets the requirement.
Yeah, and can I say just I would find helpful just, to make sure first and foremost that we're meeting the needs of the law, that what DO-IT is required to do. It sounds like there's an opportunity to reference the guidance document or the manual, whatever we want to call it, and that could be part of the iterative process that we've been talking about. You'll get information and you'll probably learn along the way that you don't want this, but you want that. And so I think that this is going to be an important part of, again, coming up with language that references something that is living and then can be a part of, again, what DO-IT believes is required to meet the law, meet the statutory requirements.
Mr. Horn, how long is the DO-IT manual?
It's like 5 pages.
Oh, it's 5
It's
pages.
not super significantly long.
Okay.
It's meant to
Oh, I
be.
thought it was like hundreds of pages.
No, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
Well, can I
Meant to
also
be
ask,
concise.
we hear about 77, it does, I don't know, do you have guidelines you can provide on top of that? Is, someone has to get on the phone 77 times, or maybe it's just a daily report that you can kind of prioritize? It just seems like there's a lot we're trying to get into prescriptively now before we've even had a chance to, begin the process, the iterative process to getting this right.
Yes, sir. And that's kind of the bridge that we had to build, right? Is how do we determine, what do we want to receive? How do we want to receive it while not being overly broad? And our attempt at that was to use MITRE ATT&CK framework categories that are indicative of full compromise. So an adversary has successfully accomplished something. And again, like if there's 77 of those a day, that's alarming, but I don't think that's true.
Okay.
And so it's just, I think, an interpretation of a standard. But I think, to Commissioner Barvey's point, like, I think that we're closer because if a utility's investigating it, that's the thing we want to know about. Not, at the end of the day, it was a failed phishing attempt, it was an AUP violation. We want to know about the things that were truly significant.
Okay, but I do support the chairman's suggestion. Maybe we come back to this, but hopefully we can provide some guidance, what would be at least helpful to each of us as commissioners.
Mr. Chairman, at the risk of, could Mr. McCormick address the MITRE ATT&CK framework? He just wanted to provide a little bit of comment on that.
Yeah, and I apologize. I don't want to belabor this. I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's important to note that the way that DO-IT is describing this is different than how the utilities interpret it. So, for example, in his example of failed or successful phishing, we would argue that his example is a failed phishing attempt. Just because a password may have been harvested doesn't mean it's useful. There's a number of defense in depth items, for example, that immediately would kick in. So their prime example of that being successful phishing, we would argue, is unsuccessful phishing. And furthermore, doesn't pose any meaningful risk to things. And what we sat down and we went, if you're not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's 15 or 16 broad categories and probably 100 categories underneath of that. We went through each one of them, and based on how their guidelines are written, we would feel compelled under regulation to report 77 items per day. I would argue that within a rounding error of 0, every one of those is meaningless, but those are the things that, as we would talk about, the events of interest that we'd spend time on. And and that's our concern, is the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a taxonomy for discussion. It's not a regulatory reporting framework. It's not used to communicate risk and threat. It's a tool for professional practitioners to talk about a cyber attack. It should not be used in the way it's being used here.
All right, fair enough. Okay,
I would just like to just add that I do have concerns that if the larger utilities can't come to the same interpretation as do it on MITRE attack, we have no chance for the smaller utilities.
Yeah, no,
so I really feel like we should be trying to put in regs language that all our utilities can understand. I mean, the only two people in the world that understand MITRE attack framework that disagree. So I basically feel like we need to have regs that
I understand.
don't rely on geeky or wonky type of
no,
terminology.
I understand that, and part of my reasoning for wanting written ideas that we can consider is to factor in how this fits in our world, so to speak.
Yeah.
So how to make this adaptable not only to the folks that are here in the room, but the folks that haven't responded to your emails. So.
Well, and that's kind of what I was getting at in terms of not identifying either the MITRE attack or the Do It manual, but just using words. That's kind of what I was asking you before. I mean, what is it that you're concerned about? And if you could just put those into words
Then we'll.
and then share that with the utilities, maybe we can
Yeah.
get someplace.
Or give it to us, and then we'll figure it out.
Right. I mean, there's always going to be room for interpretation that's going to involve, sort of, others who will sort of tell you whether it's meeting the requirements. But I think referencing external documents, especially if you each are interpreting them differently, I think is.
And maybe what would be a helpful task, if I might suggest, for the working group is to take some of these example issues that the utilities feel like they would be compelled to report and have a conversation about some of them. We can anonymize them, and determine from DoIT's perspective, interpreting the MITRE attack framework, is this something we would want to hear from? I think if we start working through examples, maybe we can come up with that kind of language. As it stands right now, we feel like that's what our requirements document does, is establish that, not exhaustive list of things we want reported, but a taxonomy,
Well, actually, in something you were talking about, you were giving some examples of beachheads in
Yes, sir.
systems, of moving laterally through a system.
sir.
It seems to me that there are probably some standard English language words and descriptions that could be used that would satisfy management's discomfort with the idea of having to report everything that they regard as a failed breach, whereas the things that you are describing sound very much like almost succeeded or successful breaches. And just in listening to everybody here, it seems to me that there's got to be a standard English way of describing these things.
The current regs talk about successful cybersecurity breaches, but yes, Mr. Commissioner Barve, we can work on that. I completely agree. This needs to be in the regulation using words. Completely agree.
Okay. Well, let's move on to zero trust.
Okay, yeah, another easy topic. Actually, why don't we do this? Let's, we don't have a court reporter, but why don't we take like a 10-minute break and then we'll pick up back on that. So.
give the general direction today.
Okay, so back on the record, Mr. Burkowski. Where are we?
Okay, thank you, Chair Hoover. I guess, actually, I feel like we could be pretty quick with the rest of this.
Okay.
And at the risk of being too optimistic, we'll talk about zero trust for a second. I feel like we're very close there.
We're trusting you, Mr. Murkowski.
Well, hopefully I can live up to your expectations. But in any case, the Maryland Cybersecurity Council had recommended some publications on zero trust, and originally we did put at least one of those two publications in as a reference document in regs, but we pulled it out. And one of the problems is that I feel like, you know, the utilities are, and there wasn't a good discussion in our work group of those specific publications, but the utilities were a little bit wary of putting a document for reference on zero trust that really hasn't, you know, been understood and socialized by everyone at this point. I'm recommending that, you know, even though these documents are recommended, I'm recommending that they be more along the best practice line, and we can consider them for future regs. But I'm not recommending we actually reference these two documents and regulations now. They aren't recommended regulations now. There was a comment from the Maryland Cybersecurity Council to use these two documents, and I do feel like the utility should use them for guidance. But again, I would want to characterize them as best practices instead of actually regulatory requirements.
Okay.
And I guess, Cyril, do you have any comment on that since that?
I do, because it was in the legislation, and we think it's important to prepare going forward. You heard my points of why I thought it was, the documentation been done, why you could measure it. The NIST has two publications, as we mentioned, one from 2020 and one in 2023, so they've been out for review, so they're not just drafted in the last couple days. What they're working on for OT security is in the works and has been drafted in 2023. Again, that's recent. So at a minimum, it would be good to have it in guidance. But the kind of, what we had suggested was, well, and also I should point out that NERC had supported Zero Trust is in their consideration. I mentioned last year in 2023, they said that it's a clear direction for continual improvement in security of our critical infrastructure against operation technologies and malware in the industrial control system. So NERC has already adopted zero-based trust as a consideration going forward to how to have an improved system. So what we had suggested, and you know, whether it appears in the regulations, I don't think it's necessary, but one of the questions have been raised by the utilities, like, well, how'd you measure that? And so we had suggested, if I may, just read a couple sentences that we had submitted that might be a guideline that you might consider in guidance. But we do think at a minimum it ought to be referenced as a goal for utilities to consider. We don't mean it to be something that you're going to be have detailed reporting on, but we suggested the following. Prioritization such so that the public service commissions provide evidence that they are ready or are planning to implement zero trust architecture in their OT and O and IT systems, and provide timelines for doing so as practical. The prioritization of such plans investment should be informed by cost and a variety of risk factors, including the degree of compatibility of technology and protocols with ZTA, the likely potential adverse effects such as increased in latency of a resource to respond, and other risk factors. Evidence of planning would consist of a documented good faith analysis to determine where the public service companies can expand implementation of zero trust architecture, the incorporation of zero trust architecture as a criteria in IT and OT asset procurement policy looking forward, and the existence of auditable asset investments demonstrating compliance with zero trust architecture, and documented company plans with zero trust architecture implementation plans and dedicated resources. This could be guidance. It doesn't have to be captured in the regulations, but we don't want the regulations to be silent on zero trust architecture because we're concerned about how we position for the future, not catching up with the enemies of the past, but China and Russia are pretty astute. We're not just worried about people shaking the doorknobs and going with a crowbar were people concerned about people with the Harry Potter invisibility shroud that get in and cause havoc from a nation state or others later. So it's kind of positioning for the future is one reason why we're looking at zero trust as an important factor for utilities to consider going forward, but not as a checklist, but as an important criteria for decision making. And we offered some guidance of how you could measure that going forward.
So if this is couched in sort of aspirational and guidance terms, does that raise your comfort level with it?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we're very close on this one now. The more we talk about it, we seem to get closer, which is good. And again, our main concern was with OT, the actual industrial controls. There really is, it's a journey to get to zero trust for some of those. That's all we wanted to point out. And so when we talk about compliance, we were talking earlier, I think we can tweak a word or two in the proposed regs while we're talking about the other things we're talking about. And we can get to, no one wants to take zero trust out of the regs.
Okay.
So we can move there. Thank you.
And does Do It have an opinion about zero
have-
trust? Or?
No, sir, that was not part of the legislator for us to have an opinion, so we have no opinion on zero trust.
Fair enough.
We do think it's important to have it in the regs.
Yeah, no, I understand. So, yeah.
I do want to point out that we did ask the DOIT CISO for guidance on zero trust, and we did receive that. And it isn't, so just a caveat there, because Senator Hester had asked the DOIT CISO.
Yeah. Okay.
And so with zero trust, and I think we had a sidebar, well, we did have a sidebar during the break, and I do think one of the main utility objections with the regs as they're written is the focus on the terminology of remediation plans. Remediation plan means that you did something wrong in some people's interpretation, but really, I think we're all aligned. It sounds like we're all aligned that this is really building maturity as we're moving towards zero trust, and it's very hard to measure, and we want to see evidence of movement towards zero trust. And I think we can all work on wording and come back to you now that we've had a meeting of the mind, so to speak. We can work on some wording that we can suggest to you. So I don't know that we really, unless somebody wants to have the hammer on zero trust, I don't know that we need to dwell on it anymore.
I think everything's fine up here. So.
Okay. We heard with the assessment plans that, and this is in Regulation 7, that everybody was pretty much okay with the exception of wanting to put the TSA exclusion language, or TSA language similar to what we had with the NERC SIP language. So we can add that, so that I really feel like with the Regulation 7 for the periodic assessments, we have consensus if we make that change.
Okay.
I would point out, though, that since we have consensus on Chapter 1, Regulation 7, that, again, I would request the Commission consider putting out an order just with that particular section, because I think that will give guidance to the rest of the public service companies what we need on July 1st.
Okay.
So, okay. So the last item that was a major, we had some major comments, was on OPC's comments regarding compliance and enforcement. And they have proposed some alternative wording where they're really, in a nutshell, wanting certain actions not to be completely delegated to the Office of Cybersecurity, to allow us to propose consent orders and to propose compliance actions, but have to bring them to the Commission. I would assume maybe a pool J, and also making certain information public. So again, you know, I don't want to reiterate what I said in my introduction, but I really feel like efficiency, while it shouldn't be an ultimate goal with a compliance and enforcement process, I think it does recognize the reality that we're going to have a number of interventions in the beginning of the implementation of this regulation. And I do feel like OPC's proposal would be an impediment to being able to deal with all the issues that we're going to have at the outset and trying to enforce these regulations. So that's my position on the OPC recommended wording.
Thank you, Commissioners. If you look at our comments, we have Appendix A to them, where we're really just adding some language into, again, as work group leader correctly assessed, essentially require any sort of proposed or consent orders or enforcement orders, enforcement compliance orders, first be filed with the commission for final. So, basically any final action, the commission would basically need to sign off on it or indicate that they want to take some other action. But need to go before the commission, or if delegated to a PULJ, but go before the commission for approval. Really the gist of our position is that, as regards efficiency, OPC doesn't think that, administrative efficiency is really a compelling justification that outweighs, the interest of transparency to the public and really to the commission itself. If you read the regulations as written, theoretically, the entire compliance enforcement process would be entirely within the purview of the Office of Cybersecurity, and the commission could theoretically never see any of it, which I think just strikes us as wrong. So I think that's essentially where that's the gist of our, why we will suggest some changes to that section.
All I'll say on that, I believe the Joint Utility Support Staff's, Mr. Burkowski's position, Mr. Advisor, sorry, John.
No.
Just to point out that NERC SIP enforcement, I don't think are public documents, is what I've been told. So, again, signaling to a bad actor that their attempt even was successful or not, or just rose to the level of anything, is providing information to bad actors that I think the NERC SIP process recognizes isn't a good idea. Understand OPC's concern for transparency, but in this type of context, other factors may outweigh that.
Sorry.
Well, actually, let me ask a question. So, if this was a redacted version of the compliance action, does that satisfy you, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we propose essentially in here, is that these compliance filings could be, or proposed orders could be, redacted heavily, and then the commission,
And so back to you,
Yeah.
if it goes through a process where either we or somebody from the Public Utility Law Judge Division considers redactions to the reports, can you live with that?
Well, better, but it's my understanding that even the FERC, the NERC SIP compliance orders they're not released at all.
I understand. Okay, I understand that. So not to do it on the spot, I don't know if you had an opinion on this, but have you run into this with other agencies, or?
So in the terms of public transparency, it's our intent as part of the Moore administration to focus on an open government, so making incidents as they impact the state of Maryland transparent to the public. But no, sir, we don't have any specific weigh in on this. I mean, I think I've fought my battle already today.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So all right, Commissioner Sushman. And then
So I wonder if there's a way to kind of separate out sort of more ministerial violations. I mean, Mr. Burkowski is talking about the fact that there are numerous small utilities, sort of small water utilities that probably will bump up against a number of these requirements early on, and is that really something that you want to be going to us and to you, as opposed to the sort of more major ones, which you'd have to give the cyber office at least some discretion, but maybe that's a way of kind of, sort of addressing the need for transparency when there really was a problem when the utility, if there's like a sort of a continual violation where the cyber office says this is too much, we're gonna bump it upstairs to the commission and have a proceeding that'll involve OPC and us, and then transparency probably makes more sense than if you've got sort of companies that are just learning about this. And is that really a necessary process to go through? I'm just sort of, I'm not saying one or the other. I'm offering this perhaps as a compromise to sort of get to what I think is probably your, or at least it would be an issue for us, is to know about the companies that continue to be a problem. That should be bumped up.
I don't disagree. I am not exactly sure, right, as I stand here, how we would differentiate the two. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you'd have to give the discretion to. I mean, the cyber office would be getting the violation notices, and to the extent that they're on their fourth violation notice for a company, that's probably an indication that there's a problem that needs to be taken upstairs, and that maybe is when you want to have transparency, because people want to know about it. DeWitt wants to know.
Sure. Yeah, I will say on a couple things. I think so if I'm not fully answering the question, I wanted to backtrack a tiny bit to the NERC SIP point. I think we think there's a slight difference between the NERC SIP issues and then these issues with cybersecurity. I mean, when we're talking about enforcement of cybersecurity regulations, we're probably not necessarily talking about, utility didn't had some sort of attack and didn't update their firewall or whatever, and like we don't want that publicly exposed, right? I think that's common practice in the industry. If you have an active incident, that you don't disclose what exactly happened until you've fixed it, right? I think we don't have a problem with that. I don't think that's necessarily what this enforcement the compliance of the regulations would really be encompassing. It would really be more like programmatic, as in X utility hadn't properly done something on
or done anything.
program.
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying that we have to be driven by the SIP compliance model, because it is different here.
Yeah.
All I'm suggesting to you is that maybe we can separate out the more ministerial violations where we don't really have to engage in that, and maybe and give that discretion to the cyber office, and let them kind of decide which is a violation that should be kicked upstairs.
Sure. I am.
So I'll interject here if that's okay. I think this is trending the right way. I agree that NERC SIP doesn't have to be that regime is not what has to be applied here, but there are some lessons out of NERC SIP that I think are valuable. The purpose of being so redacted and or anonymized and or just kind of put together into trend analyses for the benefit of regulators and the general public is valuable. But I think I would just simply say it this way: any insight into the success or failure of an attack, especially before remediation, is absolutely a signal to the adversary. Right. So we have to be really careful about that.
Right, but I think if you guys kind of take it back and sort of see that there may be situations where the commission really does need to get engaged. I mean, if we have a company out there that's just doing nothing and refuses to do anything, I mean, unless we can use our authority, it may be that company just never bothers to put cyber in.
Commissioner, can I just respond to that for one thing? In that example, though, you're putting a target on that company's back even by identifying them publicly. Just something to consider.
Well, and I guess would OPC need the company identified or just the incident identified?
I mean, if we're talking about, something where, a company is repeatedly violating, I mean, I don't think we necessarily have a problem with, like, redacting the company's name or
Yeah.
something, until, such a time, as they've remediated some of their problems, right? And then I think it's like we would like to have it sort of transparency to the commission and to the public, at some point, right?
And you could put some language in, transparent, disclosure to the extent that it doesn't impact cybersecurity. I mean, you can sort of play around with the
Yeah, discretion, and I don't know the legal construct here, but discretion of somebody, whether it's the commission or otherwise, to be able to withhold not just name, but even the incident itself for a period of time to allow for remediation. To Mr. Quinn's point about it being a target on the back, and it may not be just a target on the back of one individual company that has failed to remediate a certain problem over and over and over again. That might be a signal to the adversary that certain flavors of utility, smaller ones that are less sophisticated, don't have a defense against this thing that we're seeing over and over and over again. So you just have to be thinking about the disclosure of these incidents through the lens of the adversary, where they're getting some real interesting insights. We, EEI, had comment in the SEC rulemaking around disclosure, and while the outcome wasn't ideal, it was definitely an improvement that for national security purposes, the Attorney General can limit disclosure of a particular incident. So it's a high bar. You got to go to the AG, the U.S. Attorney General, but by going to the U.S. Attorney General for purposes of national security, some of that information that otherwise would be disclosed will not be disclosed. So think of similar constructs potentially here.
So, Mr.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Hoover, and thanks for all the comments. I just want to point out that, I have a lot of experience in the gas division or the engineering division implementing an enforcement program. And again, we've had, I know in 2022 and 2023, we've had roughly 100 NOPVs a year, which is notices of probable violations. There's a hierarchy already established within, the compliance structure. The first thing that goes out is an NOPV, which is a probable violation. It just means we have evidence that we think that there's a violation, but, there may not be. We allow the company to respond. And frequently when we send that out, we'll send that out with a compliance order. And they can agree to the compliance order, and I'll just do it. I don't want to have to make those compliance orders something that I have to go back and get permission to send out. I want to be able to say, okay, you did not file your assessment July 1st like you were supposed to. Here's an order to do it. I don't want to have to go to the commission for that.
But this actually would give the office the discretion. I wouldn't actually. I mean,
Right.
I think otherwise it becomes undoable. This would just actually give the office the discretion to say, this is just not working. We keep sending out, and then.
But this is. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, but is that already baked in?
That's baked in.
All right, then
That's baked in, and that's what I probably should have got to the end part first, but.
So you buried the lead.
Yeah. You go through several layers. You go with an NOPV, a compliance order. If the utility wants to negotiate with you on the compliance order, there's certain aspects, you enter into a consent order. And then, if you have repeated problems with utility, that's when you get to the civil penalty. So that it's an escalation in the enforcement regime. And in the end, I'm not adverse to taking civil penalties to a pull J, for instance, and anonymizing the company and, doing things that we can do, because I think the civil penalties will be very rare. My intent in enforcing these regulations is not to hand out a bunch of fines. The intent is to get people to comply with the regulations, but if something rises to the point of a civil penalty, yeah, that's maybe something that we should probably have some oversight. We have that in staff with the gas division. The gas division, you know, when you exceed a certain dollar amount for a civil penalty, we have to go, you know, to the executive director and basically make sure that, you know, he's in the loop. So there is some oversight even within staff and the engineering division when we're dealing with gas compliance. And we could do something similar to that, but I just feel like we're going to have a lot of these things in the beginning, and I really feel like we need to have some latitude to be able to issue notice of proposed violations and compliance orders and even consent decrees without having to go through a lot of additional steps because we're going to be faced with a number of these things. I think that if I were to make a line of demarcation, it would be if I feel like I can't get agreement and I need a civil penalty, then maybe that's the point at which we pull, you know, the commission or a pull J. But the, you know, and we can revisit this because I do think we'll reach a steady state where everybody's familiar with these regs and they know what we're trying to accomplish. They know what their requirements are. Maybe we'll get a lot less. I mean, one of the reasons why the gas division gets 100 NOPBs a year is they're inspecting their jobs out in the field and they're finding, you know, even something like, you know, they don't have a fire extinguisher on site and the reg says you need a fire so an NOPB gets written up. I feel like in the end, we're not going to have 100 NOPBs a year. We're going to get to a steady state. But I do think initially trying to implement these regs, it's going to be tough because there are a lot of public service companies out there that aren't engaged in this process. And I just feel like, you know, we're going to be very busy in the beginning and we will, I just predict we will get bogged down if we have to have, you know, a lot of reporting. And I've offered to both Ryan and Bill Fields to share with them the compliance information. You know, they're represent, you know, the public. They're a public advocate. You know, I'm not trying to hide what we're doing here, you know, and I'd be willing to share that for transparency. But you know, just to go through all the administrative hoops, I just feel like in the beginning especially, it's going to be tough.
So the problem's this. It's good government practice to actually err on the side of transparency, you know, and as was commented by the representative from DeWitt, you know, that's kind of the thrust of this administration, that they try to err on the side of transparency. And while, you know, giving it to the customer's lawyers, you know, is transparent to a degree, it doesn't quite, you know, rise to the level of actually, you know, what I view as transparency. So I guess I want to create a requirement that we do this. Now, I understand your concern about reporting everything, and so I'm willing to consider ways of sort of narrowing the focus, and I include in narrowing the focus this idea that there'd be the option to go to probably the public utility law judge to get information redacted, including the company name and anything else, that to avoid the situation of you know, pointing a path to the bad guys as to what to do. But I do want to come up with a process that, you know, permits us to be transparent on these things to the extent we can be. So I guess my thought is, if, you know, if you want to again give us, you know, sort of written proposals on how that can be done, and then we can, you know, decide how to craft the actual language that goes in the regs. You know, we'll put that on the to-do list. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Nothing more to say.
Okay, that's fine. So.
Well, if I could just, and perhaps the monetary penalty can be one of the triggering factors also. So that can be sort of an element of it.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who has ideas on, again, how we sort of narrow the focus so that we, accomplish the goal of transparency without, lots of unintended consequences, so.
Okay, with that, I don't believe there are any other real material issues left to discuss, unless someone wants to correct me. I think,
So anybody, is there anything else?
and I,
Anything from you? Okay, all right, Sure.
yeah, we are meeting again tomorrow as a cybersecurity work group, and so we'll start right away, and we'll get you,
So, in order for us to make some progress today, why don't you tell me which one of these regulations I can put forward in a motion for us to deal with today that we're not doing any revisions on?
actually, we had a motion,
Yeah, I understand. So I got that in front of me. So if you just tell me which ones, what's that?
yeah, I'm trying to pull it up.
Yeah, so. 'Cause that way we can at least get the ball rolling on some of these, so. So, is there any point to doing this at all? I guess is my.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, all right. Well, in that case, yeah. Okay, so I guess if we have to do it all as a package, then we'll just wait and when we revise the ones that need to be revised, then we'll come back and make this work. So.
Yeah, the only regulation it might be good to take a vote on would be regulation, Chapter 1, Regulation 7.
Yeah, right.
With the change that was discussed and proposed by the utilities, that we include the TSA security directives along with the NERC SIP in the list of acceptable attestations. And that way,
Right.
if
So-
we get agreement on that,
so-
we can issue an order.
Right.
Or,
So, one thing I'm concerned about is since, we want to add this language, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
well,
That we're inclusive of all the right language, so.
You can't actually adopt legally the regulation if you're coming back with others while that process.
All right, so we can't do that. So we
you
can't
can't do that.
separate out. Okay. All right.
okay, but you can issue an order.
Yeah, I mean, we'll discuss how to sort of deal with that.
Right.
Again, give you guys enough time to start doing this. So,
Okay.
all right. So, anything else?
Not for me.
Anybody else have anything?
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
be back. Well, so the idea is that.